Welcome to Mystery Con, where the strange feels familiar and the truth hides in plain sight. What if your dreams weren't just random? What if they were maps, blueprints left behind by something ancient, something waiting to be remembered? Across time, language, and even rain, the signal is waking us up. Now let's begin tonight's story. The first time I saw the map, it was sketched in charcoal on the underside of a temple roof in Oaxaca, and I saw my own recurring dream marked on it perfectly. I was there on assignment, cataloguing pre-Columbian symbols for a university research fellowship. It was supposed to be dry, academic work, photograph, translate, move on. I'd done it 100 times before, but that day, something was off. The roof beams were older than the rest of the structure, mismatched by at least 2 centuries. While brushing away the dust with a camel hair brush, I noticed an almost invisible set of markings burned into the wood. At first glance, they looked like constellations. Then I noticed something else. One of the patterns mirrored a dream I'd had since childhood. 5 floating islands connected by shifting bridges, each one illuminated differently. The match was too precise to ignore. I didn't tell anyone. I snapped a photo with my phone, but even as I reviewed the image later, the lines seemed to shift subtly, like the pattern resisted capture. I spent the evening pacing my room in the guest house, the image open on my screen. It wasn't just the dream. The symbols around the pattern, the arcs, the slashes, the enclosed circles, felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. I pulled out an old sketchbook I used when I was younger to document my dreams. I flipped through the pages, and there it was, sketched 10 years ago, the same shape, the same islands. My rational brain offered explanations. Coincidence, subconscious, influence, pareidolia. But those didn't sit right. Not when the pattern predated modern cartography. Not when it had been etched into the rafters of a structure buried beneath a church that itself hadn't been touched since the 1800s. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake with my laptop open, scanning archaeological references, dream research papers, and ancient symbol dictionaries. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I found an obscure reference buried in a dissertation from 1979, Cartógrafos de los Sueños, or the Dream Cartographers. It wasn't a recognized academic term, just a single footnote in a chapter about pre-Aztec codices. But the phrase lodged itself in my mind like a sliver of glass. What kind of civilization would try to map dreams? After returning home, I couldn't let it go. I digitized the photo of the Oaxaca beam and enhanced the contrast until the pattern came into sharper focus. Then I uploaded it to a private visual recognition tool I'd built during grad school, a project meant for identifying recurring motifs in pre-modern art. The system flagged 3 partial matches: a clay tablet fragment from Mesopotamia, a Tibetan thangka stored in a digital museum archive, and a micrograph from a 1967 Department of Defense-funded study on altered brain states. At first, I thought it was a bug. What would a neuroscience image be doing in the same category as ancient artifacts? But the overlay didn't lie. The branching lines in the photo from Oaxaca matched the labeled neural pathways in the micrograph almost perfectly. I traced the paper's citation trail until I found a now defunct research group out of MIT that had been studying dream states during Cold War era mind experiments. They'd called their work subconscious cartography, a phrase that chilled
me when I saw it typed in sterile courier font. The papers were dense but revealing. The researchers believed that recurring dream imagery wasn't symbolic, it was spatial. They treated dreams as landscapes and used early neuroimaging to try
mapping them like terrain. In one report, they documented test subjects navigating shared dream environments, not metaphorically, literally. They described overlapping experiences across individuals who had never met. Most of the files had been scanned by a volunteer organization, but some pages were redacted or warped by time, text smeared by water damage, or intentional distortion. One recurring diagram, labeled Internalized Terrain Schema, looked eerily like the map I'd found in Oaxaca. That night, I pulled out every notebook I had ever kept, dream journals, field notes, half-finished thoughts. As I flipped through them, I realized I'd drawn similar shapes dozens of times over the years without recognizing the connection. I started building a composite image, one part archaeological motif, one part neuroscience, one part memory. The result was unsettling. The layout, the contours, even the negative space, it wasn't just art, it felt engineered. And as I compared it to the neural maps in the old papers, I noticed something even stranger. The symbols weren't arbitrary. They correspond to real locations in the brain. Someone had mapped the subconscious centuries before science ever caught up. I was deep in the digital archives of the Vatican Library when I found the entry. It was buried in a ledger from a Spanish monastery outside Toledo, cataloguing confiscated texts deemed heretical during the Counter-Reformation. Most were predictable, apocryphal gospels, early alchemical tracts, but one line stood out: Libro de los Navegantes del Sueño, the Book of the Dream Navigators. The note beside it read, Secular Codex containing diagrams and notations inconsistent with Christian doctrine. Symbols suggest astral projection and pagan internal geographies, copied once, then sealed. That copy, I learned, was shipped to a Jesuit outpost in South America in the mid-1500s and never mentioned again. I sent out discreet inquiries to colleagues with access to Jesuit archives in Peru and Bolivia. Most ignored me. One replied with a single scanned page, yellowed, torn, written in a mix of early Spanish and Latin. The top line matched the ledger title. The page showed what looked like a map, but the coordinates were abstract. Regions labelled the place of returning faces, the hollow grove, stare of doubt. Around the edges were annotations, dream experiences written as observational. Data complete with timestamps and what looked like pulse measurements. I couldn't stop reading. The tone was clinical, but the implications were personal. These weren't fantasies. They were treated as journeys, recorded by people convinced they were documenting a real place, a shared place. I cross-referenced one phrase, entrada por la cúpula de las sombras, and found it again in an obscure Mesoamerican codex recorded decades earlier. Different culture, different language, same metaphor. Entry through the dome of shadows. The more
I looked, the more I found.
Polynesian dream navigation charts, Egyptian burial texts describing the night corridors, medieval Islamic treatises on Ilm al-Ruya, the science of visions. Each one described a layered subconscious space navigable through practice and symbol. I began to see it not as a singular map, but a network, fragments from across time and cultures pointing to the same internal geography. If these were independent inventions, the overlap was uncanny. If not, then we'd forgotten something ancient and astonishing, that early civilizations weren't mystics lost in myth. They were cartographers of the mind, and they had once known the terrain better than we do now. The building was already on my list before I understood why. Holloway Asylum had closed in 1972, left to decay on the edge of the Hudson River, a relic of mid-century psychiatric theory and federal neglect. I'd found a patient file during a routine document search. A man named James F. Alcott admitted in 1958, after reporting recurring dream episodes of spatial consistency. His intake form mentioned sketches, symbols, and something called subconscious drift states. The handwriting was erratic, but I recognized two symbols in the margins, identical to those in the Oaxaca beam. That was enough. I drove 6 hours to the site. The place was sealed, but time and weather had done most of the work. I slipped through a side door with its hinges corroded into silence. Inside, the building was a shell. Paint peeled from the walls like old bark. Water stains ran down the ceilings. The air smelled like rust and mold layered over the memory of antiseptic. I walked with care, flashlights sweeping over collapsed furniture and broken tile. The patient rooms were small and quiet, their doors left open like waiting mouths. I found Alcott's file number scratched into the doorframe of room 213. Inside, the walls were covered in graphite markings, circles, branching lines, sharp angles that matched the neural maps I'd seen. I took photos of everything. In the far corner, half hidden behind a collapsed cot, was a metal access panel marked ELEV 3B. It looked unremarkable until I saw the symbol carved beneath it, 3 intersecting lines within a circle. The same glyph from the monastery page. My hands were shaking when I pried it open. Inside was a narrow service shaft lined with cables and dust. Taped to the inner wall was a sealed envelope, brittle with age. Inside, 8 hand-drawn maps on thin parchment, each labelled in tight handwriting. Phase 1, liminal boundaries. Phase 2, lucid entrance points, and so on. The drawings showed overlapping hemispheres, internal corridors, and geometric gates. It wasn't a metaphor, it was architecture, cognitive, maybe spiritual, but structured with intent. One note stood out, written in red ink. Foundations correspond to neural clusters. Dream space is scalable through recognition. Memory, decount map. That phrase haunted me. If memory was the map, then perhaps every dream, every flash of déjà vu, was a breadcrumb. And maybe Alcott hadn't lost his mind at all. Maybe he had seen something we'd simply forgotten how to look for. I uploaded the documents to a secure academic mirror server run through a university's neuroscience department. Within 42 minutes, the access logs recorded a background ping from a masked IP address, initially registered as internal traffic, but a tracer route revealed it had been rerouted through a cybersecurity node owned by a federal contractor. That server shouldn't have had any visibility into the archive, especially since access was restricted to credentialed researchers. I pulled the files immediately, but I already knew what it meant. Someone outside the academic sphere was monitoring specific metadata patterns, likely the keywords embedded in the Alcott map file names. That night, my devices began behaving oddly. Autocomplete suggested terms I hadn't searched. My text editor auto-closed every time I wrote the word navigation. I stopped using Wi-Fi, moved in with a friend under a false last name, and took my research entirely offline. But even then, the pressure didn't ease. One of my colleagues contacted me through a burner address, saying she'd been approached by an unfamiliar research integrity board asking pointed questions about my project. She hadn't replied, but her university login was revoked the next day without explanation. I changed tactics. I created decoy files, distributed them across inactive drives, and set up alert systems for external access attempts. Meanwhile, I started cross-referencing the Alcott diagrams with anonymized fMRI scans from dream research studies. The overlap was exact. Not similar, exact. Each phase in Alcott's system was aligned with unique neural activation patterns observed in deep REM cycles. Somehow, his diagrams reflected a brain state topography that science wouldn't identify for another 50 years. Then the warnings turned inward. My password manager locked me out of my own files. My banking app flagged logins from 3 countries I'd never visited. At first, I assumed they were tracking my activity, but I began to suspect something else. These weren't external signals, they were targeted nudges, subtle disruptions meant to remind me that visibility had consequences. And though I'd taken every precaution, the message had become clear. I was nearing something someone, or something, had worked hard to bury. To verify the recurring 311 wake-up pattern, I borrowed an EEG kit from a friend at a sleep research lab who owed me a quiet favor. The device was portable, crude compared to institutional models, but reliable enough for baseline readings. Over 6 nights I recorded peak delta wave activity followed by a rhythmic burst of gamma oscillations at exactly 3:11 a.m., a rare overlap. More importantly, the waveform mirrored one of Alcott's diagrams nearly line for line. I brought the results back to my contact, presenting them as a curiosity. He blinked twice while reviewing the printout, then asked where I'd gotten access to a neural topology that hadn't been published yet. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just decoding something external. My mind was being restructured to reflect what I'd studied. The maps weren't just tools, they were templates. In the final days before going fully dark, I noticed a shift in the kind of interference I was experiencing. The threats weren't just external anymore, they were cognitive. I began forgetting mundane details, phone numbers, street names, even the layout of my own apartment. But dream recall, once fragmented, became crystalline. I started sketching entire routes the moment I woke, complete with directional markers, and symbols I'd never consciously learned. That's when I realized the transformation wasn't just neurological, it was mnemonic. The dream terrain was anchoring itself to my memory centers, building a navigable structure from what had once been abstract noise. I sent one last package, encrypted drives, printed diagrams, annotations, and EEG logs to a decentralized archive in Finland. I didn't use my real name, just a ciphered signature pulled from the monastery ledger and a timestamp. That was enough. Anyone fluent in the symbols would understand. That same night, a dark vehicle with no plates parked across from the apartment. It remained there until dawn. When I finally turned my phone on, and there was only one message, coordinates and a phrase, pattern confirmed. Vaults remain. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The vaults weren't physical. They were internal, coded spaces in the subconscious, sealed until the right sequence reactivated them. I hadn't discovered the pattern. I'd re-entered it. The dream terrain
has stopped shifting.
Each night now begins at the same location, a dim corridor with marble walls and an archway at the far end. I walk the same route, 12 steps forward, turn right, descend 3 stairs, and arrive at a door I've marked in waking life. I draw it as soon as I rise. Every time the shape is identical, it's no longer symbolic. It's spatial memory forming across sleep cycles. Each night's terrain grew clearer as I became more fluent in its design. Rooms that were once formless now had dimensions. Hallways that ended abruptly now revealed alternate routes if I walked them slowly with intention. The dreamscape wasn't random, it was reactive. My comprehension changed its layout, as if understanding was the currency that unlocked movement. I keep a journal, though I no longer write in words. It's all diagrams now, loops, spirals, angles that seem to complete themselves when I'm not looking. I sent one, anonymously, to a neuroscientist I trust. He replied with a single question. How did you access an fMRI template that doesn't exist yet? I didn't reply. There was no need. I live quietly, without a name, outside any system.
That might search for me. The pressure to prove anything is gone. This was never about evidence. It was about remembering.
I've come to believe the dream cartographers weren't mystics or philosophers. They were engineers of the interior world. Archivists, builders of terrain the conscious mind forgot how to navigate. The maps they left weren't instructions. They were reminders. If you've seen the patterns too, you'll understand. We weren't meant to discover anything new. We were meant to return to what we already knew before we forgot the way back. Not all secrets are kept in vaults. Some are buried in dreams we don't remember. I never considered my dreams to be anything more than background noise. Fragments of memory stirred up by stress and caffeine, sorted and forgotten by morning. But that changed last autumn when the same dream repeated for 13 nights. Each time the library appeared more vivid, massive shelves climbing endlessly into a ceiling I couldn't see, books without titles, just embossed symbols that shimmered in a low, pulsing light. I walked barefoot across cold marble floors, following the sound of a clock ticking somewhere unseen. It felt familiar, like I'd been there before. I assumed it was just stress from the new semester or the pressure of back-to-back lectures. But when I described the dream to Martin, a colleague from the cognitive science department, he went very still. You remembered the symbols? He asked. And the ticking clock? He pulled a folder from his bag, thin and marked in silver. Obsidian. Inside were printed dream transcripts, sleep study excerpts, and a diagram of the exact library layout I'd seen. One page listed names. Mine was the last one added. They'll reach out soon, Martin said quietly. They always do it after the 13th dream. That night I didn't sleep. Not from fear, but anticipation. Something had shifted. My dreams had always belonged to me. Now I wasn't so sure. 3 nights passed without a dream. Then, on the 4th, I woke up at 3:19 a.m. with a phrase lodged in my mind, knowledge.
has roots. It wasn't spoken, it felt left behind like a breadcrumb. I typed it into a search engine, expecting nothing more than poetry or self-help blogs. But one result linked to an internal academic server. It shouldn't have been accessible, yet the page opened.
A digital scan appeared on screen, a hand-drawn tree with 7 roots labelled in Latin, and beneath it a phrase in French, Les gardiens d'obsidienne. At the centre was a symbol from my dream, a compass with no letters, only intersecting lines. The file vanished when I refreshed the page. I called Martin. His phone was disconnected. At his office, the door was bare, the nameplate gone, as if he'd never worked there. No listing in the directory. I stood outside for a long time, uncertain if I should feel grief, confusion, or fear. I felt all 3. That afternoon, I received an anonymous email from a university address. The subject line read, "Are you still dreaming?" Nobody, no signature, just a time and place. 7 p.m, room 243 West Annex. I considered ignoring it, but I went. Inside the dimly lit room
stood a woman in a dark blazer.
She wore a silver pin shaped like the same compass from the file. "You've seen the library," she said without turning. "That means you're a candidate." I stayed silent. She already knew I was listening. "The Obsidian gatekeepers don't find people," she said. "We wait for those who find themselves." Then she looked at me and added, "Let me show you what that means." The room felt colder than it should have. She identified herself as Dr. Calder, though I doubted that was her real name. She handed me a tablet with files I wasn't cleared to see, records of decades-old sleep studies from government-backed institutions, all centered on subjects with REM continuity awareness. Each subject had experienced lucid dream states that shared specific visual features, circular libraries, geometrical symbols, ticking sounds without clocks. One note stood out. Subject retained full agency during stage 3, reassigned to gatekeeper evaluation. I thought back to a thesis I'd supervised years ago. A student had included a footnote describing vivid dreams of unreadable books and endless corridors. She'd dropped out 2 months later, citing psychological stress. Her final log entry read, "The books are always open, but I can't read the endings." I tracked down the document in the university archive, but her contact information was gone. Her student record had been marked inactive with no reason listed. Calder saw the questions forming on my face. "Most who get close lose more than memory," she said. "That's why we intervene." She told me the gatekeepers weren't a myth. They were a containment order, lucid dreamers who could stabilize, fragments of something ancient embedded in our collective unconscious. "The library is just the surface," she said. "What we protect runs far deeper." Calder gave me the location on a torn notebook page. No instructions. Just a time and a place, 11 p.m, Orford Hall. Officially condemned after a fire 25 years ago. When I arrived, the side door gave way without resistance. The smell of scorched wood lingered in the air. Dust floated in shafts of moonlight. The floor creaked beneath each step. I navigated long abandoned corridors until I found a door marked B12 in faded stenciled paint, though the building plans listed no basement level. Inside, the walls were covered in hand-drawn diagrams, brain scans, dream cartography. At the center stood a medical recliner surrounded by old bio-monitoring gear. A desk beside it held dozens of notebooks. Each entry began with the same line. The archive opens when we forget we're dreaming. One recent entry was signed with the compass symbol. The dream it described ended with the writer waking up to a black circular mark on their palm. I checked my hand. I hadn't noticed it before, a faint outline under the skin, like a scar without memory. Above me, footsteps moved slowly. Not rodents or structure shifts, boots. I killed the light and waited. They passed, never stopping. I realized then this wasn't about research anymore. I had been tagged, marked by the dream, and found by whatever existed on the other side of it. The surveillance began the next morning. A white van parked across the street. Different spots every day. Same stillness. Same unreadable presence. I told myself it was paranoia, but even that felt like a luxury now. Calder sent a message. Do not speak of the dream. Do not document it openly. But I already had. I had shown Jared, a psychologist and trusted friend, the mark on my hand. He believed me. Asked for more. That was 2 days ago. Today his office was cleared out. His name is no longer listed. Emails bounced. His phone gave only silence. In his place, I received a reply to one of my unanswered messages. Obsidian, threshold, secured. I changed devices, used burner accounts, and avoided familiar places. Still, files vanished. One night, a dream log on my screen froze and displayed a message. Root access detected. Calder's voice was tight when she called. You're breaching containment, she said. The dreams aren't just echoes, they're maps, gateways. Show them to the wrong person and a gatekeeper comes. I asked her what that meant. Her silence stretched long before she answered. You've already met one. They don't always speak. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, but
because I was beginning to understand.
The dream no longer reflected me. It read me. And some of the books now carried my name. The change came slowly. The library dream was gone. In its place were shifting corridors, mirrored rooms, voices layered over each other in harmonic loops. I saw versions of myself, doing things I didn't remember, speaking words I hadn't learned. Calder had vanished. I returned to Orford Hall. The staircase to room B12 was gone. The wall where the door should have been was sealed with old brick, like it had never existed. That night, in the dream, I found a page pinned to a floating pillar. It was my handwriting signed with the compass symbol. I woke up sweating, my hand stinging. The mark was darker now. I searched through Calder's files and found an unindexed document, just one sentence. The Obsidian gatekeepers do not protect knowledge. They contain it. I read it again. The dreams weren't revelations, they were locks, neural firewalls designed to suppress an ancient signal, a consciousness too vast to exist in our waking minds. And the lucid dreamers, we were the locks, and now we were failing. The signal had begun to adapt. The dreams were seeping into my waking memory. and I had crossed from observer to participant. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I feared returning, but because I feared bringing something back. I live simply now, no name, no paper trail. I move between towns, sleep in short intervals, never twice in the same place. The dreams don't visit, they persist. The mirrored rooms, the corridors, the voices, they follow me even while awake. Sometimes I catch myself mouthing words. I
don't understand. I keep a journal, but the pages fill themselves. I don't remember writing them. And when I read them, they feel instructional. Messages not meant for me, but for someone using me.
Calder's voice visits sometimes in the moments between waking and sleep. Stay asleep, she says. That's all. I finally understand. The signal isn't evil. It's indifferent. But it knows we're here, knows what we fear, and it learns. The gatekeepers never protected the world from some hidden truth. They protected it from what happens when truth becomes unreadable, when thought itself becomes a channel. I'm still holding for now. Still lucid. But if you've seen the compass, if the books in your dreams are starting to show familiar names, then I need you to listen carefully. You are not dreaming, you are being read, and you need to decide right now if you're strong enough to forget. Before we go any further, pause. Like this video, if something inside you already knows. Subscribe if the patterns feel too precise to ignore. And answer this in the comments. Have you ever woken up certain that what you saw wasn't just a dream? We're tracking responses. Quietly, I used to think the sound of rain was just background noise until I realized it was speaking to me. Most nights I fall asleep to the gentle rhythm of rain on my window. Not because I love the weather, but because the sound helps me forget how quiet my apartment really is. I live alone, top floor, with only the distant hum of traffic and the occasional drip from a faulty gutter to keep me company. Lately, though, the rain's been different. Not louder or softer, just off. It started 3 weeks ago. A light spring shower came through around midnight, nothing unusual. But as I listened, something in the rhythm caught my attention. It wasn't constant like it should have been. There were breaks, brief, repeating patterns like a code. I thought I was imagining it. Sleep-deprived, probably overworked. But the next night, the pattern was back. Same time, same rhythm. I recorded it on my phone and played it back the next morning. The strange thing, it didn't sound like anything unusual on playback, just normal rain. I told myself to let it go. Maybe I'd read too many Reddit threads about government sound experiments or those eerie low-frequency hums no one can explain. Still, I couldn't shake it. One night, half asleep, I started whispering the rhythm out loud, just mouthing the pattern. And then I got this sudden, involuntary shiver, like my body was reacting before my brain could catch up. That was the first night I dreamed in another language. I didn't recognize the words, but they felt familiar. The cadence, the tone. It was like listening to something buried deep inside my memory. The dream faded fast, but the feeling didn't. I woke up certain I'd been told something important. The next day I started searching for answers, not about dreams or rain, but about sound, ambient frequencies, historical uses of auditory trance. That's when I found the forum. A thread buried under hundreds of posts titled only The Whisperers. Most of it looked like nonsense, but one user had written something that stopped me cold. Rain doesn't fall randomly, it speaks. The trick is remembering how to listen. That night, I stayed up and listened again. The forum wasn't new, but it looked abandoned, minimal, design, no ads, mostly dead links. Still, the thread titled The Whisperers had over 600 views and 3 active contributors. I scrolled through the posts, which ranged from the cryptic to the clinical, most sounding like half-forgotten memories or garbled instructions. But one post stood out, not for what it said, but how it was written. Calm, methodical, almost like a field report. The user went by Harmonic 3. Their messages outlined the use of specific ambient recordings, rain, wind through pine, distant thunder, to trigger altered states of perception. They referenced historical texts, sound resonance, experiments, and a practice I'd never heard of called atmospheric transcription. I looked it up. Nothing mainstream. Just a few scattered mentions in obscure anthropology papers and discredited journals from the 70s. But the more I read, the more I saw connections. Harmonic 3 claimed these sounds, especially rain, weren't random. They carried patterns embedded over time, passed down through ritual and repetition. A few links led to downloadable audio files labeled clean patterns. I hesitated, scanned them for malware, then downloaded one labeled Cascade North, June 1998. I played it on headphones. It was just raining at first. Then, slowly, the sound shifted. Not obviously, no glitch, no change in volume. Just something subtle in the background, a pulse-like quality underneath the falling drops. I played it again. This time, I noticed my breathing had synced to the rhythm, and my hands felt heavy in my lap. I closed my eyes. A series of disconnected images flickered behind my eyelids. Stone circles, firelight, a bowl of water reflecting a storm. It only lasted a minute. When I opened my eyes, the room felt colder. I checked the thermostat, same as always. I replayed the clip 3 more times, trying to catch the change. There was no voice, no melody, just structure. It wasn't music, it was memory. Afterward, I searched Harmonic 3's username across other platforms. I found an inactive SoundCloud account under the same name, with only one file left online, a short ambient track titled Mnemosiny T Sequence. The description read, "Auditory key, triggers ancestral retention in quiet listeners. Use it responsibly." The file had a date stamp, 2009. The comments were locked. But the title, Mnemosyne, the Greek goddess of memory, kept ringing in my head. I was no longer just hearing the rain. I was beginning to remember it. I spent the next 2 days pulling at threads I wasn't sure were even connected. Mnemosyne sequence didn't turn up anywhere else, but I found a single reference to it in an archived academic journal from 1981, scanned and forgotten in a university database. The paper was about sound induction techniques used by pre-modern cultures to access generational memory states, a term the author never clearly defined. But one paragraph mentioned a ritual practiced by an unnamed highland tribe in South America, where groups would gather in stone circles during rainfall, surrounding a carved dish of water. They believed the rain carried messages from the ancestors, and by listening in absolute stillness while watching the ripples, they could receive instruction. the ambient sound of rain was considered sacred, not because of the water, but because of the rhythm. The rituals were designed not to worship the rain, but to decode it. I found scans of the original field notes. Among them was a sketched symbol, a circle divided by 3 lines, each angled toward the center like a spinning triangle. I recognized it instantly. It had been carved into the audio waveform of Mnemosyne sequence at the 13-second mark, visible only when slowed to a spectrogram and inverted. I ran the waveform through the same tool used in sound design for spectral editing. At first it was noise, but then faintly a shape emerged in the data, almost like a diagram overlaid onto the
Ambient texture. It looked hand-drawn, imperfect.
3 concentric circles, a repeating motif of waves, and 1 phrase buried in the noise floor. Remember the vessel? It didn't make sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen that phrase before. I went back to the forum, reread every post by Harmonic 3. In one, they quoted an ethnomusicologist describing memory vessels as physical objects, bowls, bells, even caves, that held not liquid, but resonance. Sound, when captured and replayed within these vessels, supposedly triggered sensory phenomena beyond the 5 senses. The post ended with a chilling observation. When the resonance is correct, the vessel doesn't echo. It listens. That night, I couldn't sleep. I left my windows open and recorded the rain for hours. And, just after 3 a.m., the waveform matched the sequence from the file. Not close. Identical. That's when I realized this wasn't a one-time event, but a broadcast. Transmission from something old, and still very much alive. Something old, something is still broadcasting. I drove out to the site just before dawn, guided by coordinates hidden in the metadata of the Mnemosyne sequence file. It was an hour north, tucked into the edge of a state forest, where service roads had long given way to mud and silence. I had to park at the trailhead and hike the last mile, past a sagging chain-link fence with a broken lock and a faded government warning about structural instability. The building was older than I expected, a squat, windowless facility overgrown with vines and moss. A small weather station still stood beside it, half collapsed. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and rust. Empty shelves, overturned desks, and waterlogged folders littered the floor. Most of the equipment had been stripped, but one room in the back still held a reel-to-reel recorder, its tape warped but intact. Beside it was a dusty cabinet labelled Transcription Logs, 1964-1982. I opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of handwritten reports, each describing rainfall patterns recorded at this exact site. They weren't meteorological. The logs detailed dreams experienced by volunteers during controlled rain sessions, each accompanied by a spectral breakdown
Of the audio.
The similarities were eerie. Words and phrases repeated across different names and years. The vessel, ripples like breath, returning voices. One entry caught my attention. It described a subject who, during a July storm in 1976, entered a trance after listening to a specific sequence of rainfall. According to the observer's notes, the subject spoke in a language no one could identify, then stopped breathing for nearly 2 minutes while remaining conscious. When revived, he wrote a single phrase over and over. Sound remembers what we forget. I found the corresponding reel labelled Rain 076 Joule and carefully loaded it onto the machine. It hissed and crackled, then played a low rhythmic downpour layered with faint harmonic pulses. I sat in the middle of the room, listening. Within minutes, I felt that same weight in my limbs, the familiar shiver in my chest. Only now it was
Stronger, sharper. The walls around me felt closer somehow, as if they were listening too.
That's when I noticed the markings carved into the concrete beneath the recorder. The same symbol again, 3 lines spiraling inward. And below it, etched by hand, when it rains here, it speaks clearly. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there, letting the sound work its way into the space behind my thoughts. I think it was the first time I realized I wasn't alone in this. Not really. I was just the latest to return to a place where the rain had always been talking. I didn't go home right away. I sat in the car outside the abandoned station, rain still drumming softly on the roof, the recorder's sounds replaying in my
Head. I knew what I had found wasn't just an artifact. It was active. The facility may have been shuttered, but the signal hadn't stopped. Someone had studied it for nearly 2 decades, and then, abruptly, everything had been packed away.
or left to rot. I took photos of the logs and recorded the reel's playback onto a portable device. When I got back to town, I uploaded a short clip from Rain 076 Joule to a hidden cloud folder and sent a message to a friend of mine, Nina, an acoustic technician I used to work with during a university project years ago. I didn't explain much, just asked her to analyze the frequency structure and tell me if she noticed anything strange. She replied within hours. "Where did you get this?" her message read. "It's layered with a spatial modulation technique we use in environmental mapping, except it's inverted, like it's echoing from inside out. This isn't just ambient noise, it's designed." Her words hit me harder than I expected. If the rain signal was designed, then someone or something was behind it. Later that night, my email account locked me out. My phone rebooted twice without warning. And when I tried to access the cloud folder I'd created for Nina, it was gone. Not corrupted, deleted. I called her. No answer. I tried again and again, until finally a voicemail picked up. Not hers. Just a faint loop of static and distant rainfall. I didn't leave a message. I knew what this meant. I'd touched something I wasn't supposed to, something that hadn't been entirely forgotten. I changed devices, encrypted backups, even printed hard copies of the logs. But it felt like a formality. I was already being watched. The next morning, a white sedan idled outside my apartment for over an hour. No plates, windows tinted. It didn't follow me when I left, but I didn't go back. I booked a motel under a different name and started using public networks only. Each step I took to protect myself only confirmed the thing I hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't just
About sound, it was about memory, about control.
if rain could carry information, and that information could alter perception, then whoever once ran that facility had been working on a way to rewrite memory itself. Not chemically, not digitally, but acoustically, through sound that could bypass awareness and go straight to the place where memories form. That's why the experiments were hidden. That's why the recordings were buried. And that's why someone was now trying to stop me from remembering what they tried so hard to erase. The rain started earlier than usual that evening, soft at first, then steady. I was staying in a borrowed cabin near the edge of a wildlife reserve. No neighbours, no signal, just me and the woods. I'd brought the recordings, printed logs, and a backup drive containing every note I'd compiled. I needed distance to process it all, to figure out what came next. The silence out there made the sounds clearer. When I played Rain 076 Jewel, again through a set of noise-isolating headphones, I noticed something I hadn't before. Beneath the ambient hiss, a second signal. It wasn't obvious, but once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. A slow oscillation like the call and response pattern in traditional chant. I used an audio spectrogram to isolate it. The shape was familiar, the same spiral seen in the old.
Logs, the carved symbol at the facility, and the waveform from the Mnemosyne sequence.
Only now, it was layered with modulation frequencies used in modern sound therapy. Someone had updated the pattern. This wasn't an ancient relic. It was active research, still evolving. I traced the metadata from the version I downloaded. It had been uploaded from a university server in Oslo, masked through a VPN. The uploader had used the same alias, Harmonic 3. They weren't just relics from an old forum. They were still alive, still working. I sent a message using a secure Dropbox, referencing a line from one of their posts. The vessel doesn't echo, it listens. A day later, I got a reply. No greeting, no explanation. Just an audio file. I played it. It began with rainfall, natural and unassuming. But layered beneath it were vocalizations, low, steady syllables in a language I didn't recognize, recorded in a large, reverberant space. The rain blended into the voice, then into the same geometric rhythm I'd heard. Before, I felt my skin prickle, my arms went cold, and then, like a switch flipping, a memory surfaced. Not mine. A wide stone basin in a circular room. Dozens of people seated silently in the dark. Rain drips through a carved aperture in the ceiling, landing in perfect intervals on the surface of the water. I wasn't watching. I was participating. I was one of them. The memory passed as quickly as it came, leaving only a raw ache behind. I shut off the recording. My hands were shaking, not out of fear, but something more difficult to name. Grief. I wasn't remembering a ritual I had read about. I was remembering one I had lived, and whatever this research was, it wasn't unlocking new knowledge. It was waking something up. Something buried deep in the blood, in the bones. That was the moment I realized the truth. The signal wasn't a message. It was a reminder. I didn't leave the cabin for 3 more days. I ate little, slept in short bursts, and kept the rain recordings playing at low volume in the background. I wasn't trying to induce anything anymore. I just needed to understand what had already happened. My memories weren't visions or dreams now. They came without warning, like fragments slipping through cracks in the floor. A fire-lit gathering. A carved bowl passed hand to hand, chants that synchronized with the rhythm of rain falling through hollowed stone tubes. I wasn't remembering history. I was remembering a life. Maybe more than one. The patterns embedded in the recordings weren't just auditory triggers, they were keys. Each time I listened, another door opened. Small, quiet doors leading inward. I contacted Harmonic 3 one last time. I didn't ask questions, I didn't need answers, I just told them what I remembered. They responded with a single sentence. The memory was never lost, only made quiet. I saved it, then destroyed every file I had. I burned the notes, smashed the backup drive, erased my digital traces. Not out of fear, but necessity. This wasn't a secret to be exposed. It was a lineage that had survived beneath the noise of the modern world, hidden inside the most ordinary thing. Weather. I couldn't carry it forward in data or proof, only in memory. I returned to the city eventually, moved back into my apartment. Life resumed its pace, emails and deadlines and quiet walks to the store. But I changed the way I sleep. I don't use recordings anymore. I only open the window and wait for the rain. When it comes, I close my eyes and listen, not for voices or messages, but for the rhythm itself. And sometimes, just before sleep, I feel it again. The pull, the gathering, the stillness before the chant. I don't know who we were. I don't know why it had to be forgotten. But I know this. Somewhere, across the world, others are listening too. And the rain, steady and soft, keeps whispering its way back through us. Not to be decoded, not to be feared, but to be remembered. If that was true, then whatever I was uncovering didn't need me to decode it. It needed me to activate it. And maybe I already had. The dreams were coming faster now, more vivid, structured. I'd meet people I didn't recognize, but they spoke to me like we'd known each other for years. One woman told me calmly, "We've built the bridge again. You're walking it." I started waking up with muscle aches, as if I'd been climbing or running. Nora said I was talking in my sleep, repeating the same line. They are coming through. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew I couldn't keep this to myself much longer. If others were dreaming the same things, if there was truly a shared space behind our minds, then hiding it would be a kind of betrayal. Still, I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of something worse. Recognition. Part of me already understood that once I shared the codex, I'd lose control of it. And maybe that was the point. I uploaded the first batch of files just after midnight, cloaked behind layers of VPNs and dead-end accounts. A private server, a locked link, sent only to a handful of contacts, people I'd followed for years, voices I trusted on obscure channels and research threads. No subject line, no explanation, just the data. I expected silence or skepticism. Instead, I got acknowledgement, not questions, not praise, just one phrase echoed back from 3 different sources. The page is open. That was all it took. The next day, I noticed the change. My phone rang once, no caller ID, then stopped. My browser tabs closed on their own. My laptop's camera light blinked on without prompting. I told myself it could be software glitches, but deep down I knew better. Then came the physical trail. Someone had been in our apartment. Nothing was stolen, nothing broken, but things had shifted subtly, deliberately. A chair slightly out of place, a coat hung backward, A file on my desk was renamed Read Me Last TXT. Inside it was blank, just the file name itself, like a whisper left behind. I told Nora everything that night. I had no choice. She didn't panic. Instead, she looked at me quietly for a long time and said, "I've seen it too, just once, but I never talked about it." She described a dream from me 3 years ago, an empty library with books she couldn't open, a man standing at the far end, holding a page that glowed. He said only one thing: "You forgot this." My stomach turned. That same line had appeared in one of the forum logs I archived. That's when I understood. We weren't users of the codex, we were subjects of it. This wasn't a book or a practice. It was a structure we'd been circling for years, each of us dreaming our way closer to it without knowing. The files I shared had started to appear elsewhere, reposted and remixed in obscure corners of the web, but with them came the same warning. Dreamers who accessed too many fragments too quickly began losing track of real time. One described waking up with a nosebleed, another forgot their child's name for 5 minutes, a third claimed they could no longer tell whether conversations they remembered had happened while awake or not.
I was already too deep. My own dreams were now layered, recursive. I'd wake into another dream, then another, then sit up in bed unsure if I was still sleeping. The codex had opened and I was falling through it. I no longer keep track of what
day it is. Time feels stretched, thin at the edges, as if whatever boundary kept waking life and dreams apart has softened for good. I moved us to a small cabin 2 hours from the city. No signal here, no neighbours. Nora agreed without hesitation, as if she'd been waiting for the silence. Most nights we don't talk about it, but sometimes around dusk she'll ask if I remember a place, a room with stone walls and moving light, or a staircase that loops back into itself. I do. We always remember the same things. Shared dreams used to feel like metaphors. Now they feel like geography. The codex continues to evolve, or maybe just unfold. I found a new page this morning, not in a dream, not online. It was printed, tucked under the doormat. Unmarked, but unmistakable. The same texture, same pattern. At the top, a line I hadn't seen before. Completion is not closure.
memory is a cycle. I burned it after reading, but I memorized every word, not because I thought I'd need it, but because it felt like part of me already knew. Some days I walk into the woods and just listen. There's no voice, no signal.
But I hear something, not with my ears exactly. It's more like a pressure, a gentle suggestion, like being nudged toward a door you've already opened. I don't resist, I'm not afraid. The fear was something I shed long ago, replaced
by a kind of quiet certainty.
I'm not the only one anymore. The network is growing. Not a group, not a cult, just scattered people, slowly waking inside their own minds. Some find each other. Some choose silence. I chose this, to see it through, whatever the codex is, and
ancient text, a cognitive structure, a memory we've inherited. It's alive now, active, and it remembers us more clearly than we remember ourselves.
I don't think it wants worship. I think it wants witnesses. Tonight, I'll dream again. I know that before I fall asleep. I'll walk the corridor. I'll find the room with the page that hasn't yet been written. And this time, when I turn it, I won't ask what's coming. I'll simply say, I remember too. It started with a dream I didn't have, but someone else remembered for me. For most of my life I slept like a brick. No vivid dreams, no restless nights, just 8 hours of blackout silence. So when Nora, my partner, described a dream I'd supposedly had, a conversation in a forest clearing, a phrase I allegedly whispered in my sleep, it didn't alarm me. People talk in their sleep. It happens. But the phrase she repeated back to me, turn the page beneath the breath, felt like something I'd read before, only I hadn't. Not in any book on my shelf, not in any course I'd studied. I shrugged it off. Until the next morning, when I found a printed flyer stuck in our apartment mailbox. Unmarked, aged paper. No sender. Just a short passage typed, out in clean serif font. To master the self, one must first dream together. Turn the page beneath the breath. I read it 3 times before setting it down, my skin prickling with a quiet static I couldn't explain. That night, curiosity edged into something deeper. I sat in bed scrolling obscure forums and image boards, hunting for the phrase. Hours passed. One thread led me to a user named Sphenodream. Their posts were sparse, cryptic. But one entry stopped me cold. The lucid codex was never lost. It was simply waiting to be dreamt again. Shared states are reactivating. It was dated 2 days ago. The next post in the thread from another user read, Page 19 woke me up. We are not alone in our dreams. Anymore? I didn't sleep that night. When I finally dozed off near dawn, I woke to find the same line scrawled across the inside cover of my notebook, one I hadn't opened in weeks. The handwriting was mine. I stared at it, heart thumping, unable to remember when or why I had written it. Something was happening, a signal was coming through, but from where and why I couldn't yet say. I didn't tell Nora, not yet. I wasn't ready to say it out loud, that something I didn't understand was embedding itself into my life. Instead, I went back online, not to the usual forums, but deeper, to mirrored sites and anonymized archives. It took time to find anything useful, but one post stood out, buried on a discontinued lucid dreaming board. The thread was titled Codex Fragments, Confirmed Visual Matches. A user had uploaded images of handwritten symbols copied from a manuscript they claimed was passed around a Berlin sleep study group in the late 90s. I saved the images, cross-referenced the shapes with my own notebook. A few matched, too closely to dismiss. The symbols weren't just scribbles, they followed a system, a structure that echoed something linguistic, but not quite readable. I downloaded a copy of the image set and ran it through a translation tool designed for lost alphabets. The program didn't return a translation. Instead, it generated a single, looping phrase, shared perceptual lattice forming. I wasn't even sure what that meant, but it didn't feel like a coincidence. The deeper I went, the more it became clear. This wasn't just fringe theory. Academic papers, now deleted but cached in internet archives, mentioned synchronized hypnagogic states and unprovoked memory transference between subjects. The term lucid codex appeared 3 times, each time in the footnotes, never defined. The last document I read was a scanned transcript of an interview with a linguist who claimed to have seen the codex in person. She described the text as part manuscript, part ritual, part mirror. That night, I dreamt for the first time in months. I was walking through a stone corridor lined with tall glass panels. Behind each one stood a version of me, some older, some younger, some not quite right. When I reached the last panel, I stopped. It was empty, but as I watched, something stepped into the frame. Not me, not anyone, just a presence. When I woke, I found the phrase, shared perceptual lattice forming, written again, this time on the condensation of the bathroom mirror. I hadn't been there yet. Nora swore she hadn't either. My digital search had started out of curiosity, but now it felt more like permission, like something wanted me to keep going. Over the next week, I stopped pretending this was just a digital mystery. It was seeping into the physical world, into places it shouldn't have reached. I found an old thread archived by the Wayback Machine, posted by a former sleep technician who worked in northern Italy during the early 2000s. The clinic, she claimed, conducted unofficial research on dream synchronization, funded through anonymous grants. Her logs described patients speaking the same phrases upon waking, many in languages they didn't know. One phrase came up more than once. Beneath the breath, the page unfolds. That line was now the third time I'd seen it. Once, from Nora, once on the flyer, and now here. The technician mentioned a set of materials distributed to test subjects, mostly symbols and visual focus charts. But one entry stopped me, an image she'd uploaded before the clinic was shuttered. It was a page torn from what she labelled Codice Lucido. Same pattern work, same curved grid lines. This wasn't a name someone invented in a forum. The Lucid Codex was real, and someone had been experimenting with it. I went further, pulling university records from Bologna, where the technician had allegedly studied. No published research under her name, but one footnote in a 2004 neuroscience dissertation cited a proprietary sleep induction manual shared in a private colloquium. No title given, just a note, used in the dream architecture
model. That was enough for me.
I contacted the author using an encrypted email, posing as a grad student. I didn't expect a reply, but I got one the next day. Short, cautious. I don't share those materials anymore. You're not the first to ask. I responded carefully, asking if the Lucid Codex was ever publicly distributed. Her answer came 5 minutes later. It was never published. It was transmitted. The word choice sent a chill down my spine. Transmitted, like a broadcast, like a signal, like something you received, not read. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't want to. I kept thinking about those synchronized phrases, the mirrored dream symbols, the repeated idea that this wasn't a text, but a doorway. And if others had stepped through it, I had to know what was on the other side. It led me to a crumbling sanatorium 2 hours outside the city, the kind of place swallowed by trees and silence, listed as condemned but never demolished. I'd found it referenced in the technician's old forum posts under a different name. The Convergence site. Supposedly, the codex had been tested there, passed between lucid dreamers in isolation chambers. I arrived just after noon with a flashlight, gloves and a half-charged phone I didn't expect to use. The building was exactly
as I imagined. Sun-bleached walls, broken windows, graffiti marking where curiosity had turned to vandalism.
But what I came for wasn't visible from the surface. According to the post, the real work had taken place in the basement. I found the stairs behind a collapsed reception desk, leading into a corridor that smelled of mildew and rust. Most of the rooms were empty, long stripped of equipment, but one had a door still sealed shut, heavy, reinforced, the kind used in soundproofing. I forced it open with my shoulder, metal grinding against the frame, and stepped inside. It wasn't large, maybe 12 feet across, with acoustic foam still clinging to parts of the wall. In the center stood a rusted chair bolted to the floor, surrounded by decaying speakers angled toward it. On the far side of the room, a corkboard lay face down. I flipped it carefully and found dozens of pinned index cards, some blank, others filled with symbols I now recognized. But it was the journal tucked beneath the board that stopped me. Damp and warped, but intact. The cover read, "Session Records, Shared Dream Trials." I turned the pages slowly. Most were clinical, detailing doses of melatonin and environmental conditions, but halfway through the tone shifted. The subject, listed only as H, began writing in first person. "I see the lattice now. It hums behind the sky. I am not alone in my sleep." The next few pages showed sketches, rings of symbols orbiting a human figure with no face. The final entry was a single sentence. "The Codex doesn't teach, it remembers." I stood in that room for a long time, breathing the damp air, knowing I'd stepped into something irreversible. The Codex wasn't waiting to be found, it was waiting to be recalled. And somehow I was part of its memory. I spent the next few days cataloguing everything, the journal scans, the symbols, the mirrored phrases, organizing them into a private folder on an encrypted drive. I backed it up twice and stored one copy offline. I didn't know who might care that I had this, but I was starting to understand the pattern. Everyone who touched the Codex either vanished from the public record or retreated into silence. The technician, the linguist, the subjects of the dream study, none had surfaced in years. It didn't feel like a coincidence. I tried contacting the researcher again, the one who said it was transmitted. My message bounced. Her email no longer existed. I searched for her name on academic databases, but the citations were gone, too scrubbed like a typo. That was the first moment I considered I might not be the only one looking. That someone, or some group, had a vested interest in containing this. My phone started acting strange after that, calls dropping mid-sentence, battery draining overnight, search history resetting. Nora noticed, but I brushed it off. She knew I was working on something I called a sleep cognition project, but I hadn't told her the truth.
Not yet. I was starting to see the danger in knowing. I kept thinking about the phrase, "The Codex doesn't teach, it remembers."
The same word kept appearing in my dreams, spoken by no one, in a language I didn't know, yet understood completely. I first noticed it on a Tuesday morning, sometime around 4:20 a.m., when I woke up with a word caught at the edge of my mouth. It wasn't English, it wasn't French or German or anything I'd studied as a linguistic archivist, but I knew what it meant, beginning. Not because I translated it, just because I knew. That morning, I wrote it down phonetically in the margin of a newspaper. Aliyah. The syllables felt familiar, like something I hadn't learned but had once known. I figured it was just a dream artifact. Stress, maybe. Dreams borrow language all the time. But then it came again, the next night, and the one after, always the same voice, low, neutral, deliberate, always the same word, as if it was waiting to be heard. I didn't tell anyone. My field already exists on the fringe of mainstream scholarship. Most of my colleagues study dead tongues, Proto-Indo-European, Elamite, Sumerian dialect spoken, before ink existed, but dreams don't get peer-reviewed. So I stayed quiet. Until I found the forum. It was buried deep on a back-channel server, a site for fringe linguistics and sleep anomalies. I posted my experience under an alias, expecting silence. Instead, I got 3 responses within the hour, all from different parts of the world, all describing the same word, Aliyah. Same pronunciation, same tone. One responder was asleep, researcher from Helsinki. She said she'd been compiling dream language fragments since 2018. Another was a retired field linguist in Kenya who uploaded a scan of his dream journal from 15 years earlier. My word matched 6 of his entries. The third post was anonymous, no name, no details. Just one line. You're hearing Proto-Oniric. Keep recording. They remember when we speak. That sentence stuck with me because deep down I didn't feel like I was dreaming anymore. I felt like I was remembering something no one had spoken in a very long time. After that night, everything changed. I wasn't just dreaming, I was listening. And, more importantly, something was responding. I bought a small voice-activated recorder and kept it by my bed. Each morning, I'd review the audio. Soft fragments, muttered syllables I didn't remember saying, but they were consistent, recognizable. The same strange sounds repeated with increasing rhythm and structure. I processed them using phonetic analysis software, something I used during my early research days. The results were clear. These weren't just fragments, they followed patterns, there was grammar. I began compiling a database. Each night brought new entries, verbs, modifiers, even what looked like cases or tenses. Within 2 weeks, I had over 400 unique phonemes. Salla Virtanen, the researcher from Helsinki, reached out. She'd been tracking similar data across sleep, patients in clinical studies. When I sent her my list, she replied in under an hour. Some of these match ours exactly. I think we're working on the same thing. Our calls became regular, encrypted, and cautious. We were soon joined by others, a neurologist from Montreal, a data analyst in São Paulo, a semiotics professor based in Kyoto. Each of them brought pieces. The analyst showed us a dream language heat map built from anonymized dream logs. The overlap was undeniable. Clusters appear where linguistic diversity was once the richest, he said. The Caucasus, Southeast Asia, the Horn of Africa. Salla said what we were all thinking. We're not inventing this language, we're recovering it. That sentence stayed with me because none of us believed we were discovering something new. We were reassembling something that had been scattered across time and maybe scattered on purpose. We started calling it Proto-Oniric, a placeholder, but it fit. The dream language. I spent my days buried in old phonetic archives comparing our findings with pre-literate cultures. Nothing matched. Then I found an obscure tablet transcription from Çatalhöyük listed in a forgotten corner of a university database. The symbols weren't associated with any known script, dismissed decades ago as decorative. But one repeated glyph aligned with a word from our list, amaru, which we believed meant to return. I contacted an archivist in Ankara I'd worked with before. She was skeptical, but agreed to rescan the artifact. The report came back. The symbols were laid out in a spiral pattern, too consistent to be random. Not decorative, she admitted, deliberate, but unknown. Around the same time, Salah sent me something chilling, a Soviet sleep study from the 1970s. It had been buried in a discredited parapsychology file, declassified only recently. The key line read, "Subjects speak in unknown utterances, shared phonetic root, consistent structure." They had dismissed it as mimicry, but we knew better. These weren't anomalies, they were echoes. I found myself wondering why this language had disappeared. Languages evolve, sure, but they leave trails, loan words, syntax fossils, cultural drift. This one had left nothing, no trace, as if it hadn't vanished on its own, as if it had been erased. I remember something Salah said during one of our late-night calls. Maybe
Speech wasn't invented, maybe it was inherited, and we've just been mispronouncing it ever since.
I didn't answer right away, because I was beginning to think she was right. The storage building wasn't on any current university map. A line item in an old budget report led Salah there, a leased warehouse outside the city, marked linguistics.
Archives. Unprocessed. Inside, the air was cold and dry, the light coming through broken skylights, cabinets stretched into the dark, filled with phonograph reels, forgotten paper notes, decaying index cards. After hours of sorting, we
Found a sealed crate, 12 notebooks, no name, just private material, sleep lexicon, stamped faintly on the lid. The earliest entry was dated 1961. Each notebook was meticulous, dream phrases written in IPA transcription, cross-referenced with hand-drawn glyphs. Many matched our records exactly, others extended them, suggesting grammar rules we hadn't considered. A few margins contained unnerving comments. They correct pronunciation through repetition. And later, when spoken aloud, they respond. That line hit like a dropped weight. This wasn't theoretical. Someone had already tried. And they weren't just dreaming, they were speaking. I turned to Salah. She said nothing, but I saw the shift in her face. Until that moment, we'd treated this as a discovery, academics, abstract. But the notebooks made it real. Someone had spoken this language back into the world. And something had been answered. We didn't take the notebooks home. I scanned every page, encrypted the files, and stored them offline. We agreed to only meet in person, never online. It wasn't paranoia. It was a precaution. That night, I decided to test the sentence. A full phrase reconstructed from the notebooks and our data. I waited until just before sleep and whispered, "Nuve Alasha." I didn't know its exact meaning, only that it carried weight. Reverence. I fell asleep within minutes. The dream was different, not chaotic or shifting. I stood in a space that wasn't physical, surrounded by silence. Then came the presence, not visible, but undeniable. It didn't speak, it conveyed. Concepts passed between us in pulses, emotion, memory, recognition. When I woke, I remembered one word: return. I didn't document the dream digitally. I wrote it in a notebook. 2 days later, I received a message. No sender, no subject, just an audio file. A voice repeating one of our phrases, not perfectly, but close. I asked Salah. She hadn't sent it. Neither had anyone else. That same afternoon, our shared cloud folder was gone. Not corrupted, wiped. Server access traced back to a university subnet decommissioned over a decade ago. We didn't panic, but our conversations grew shorter. The weight in the room was new. We weren't uncovering something hidden anymore. We were disturbing something buried, and it had noticed. 3 weeks later, we read the full sentence aloud, together, inside a sleep lab isolated from all signals, monitored only by analog instruments. Tamalu ven ashere nuva. The translation was loose, but the intent was clear. We remember and return to the shared mind. We slept within minutes. What followed wasn't a dream, it was an encounter. I stood inside a structure made of meaning, not matter. Symbols pulsed around me, familiar yet unreadable. In front of me were beings, or echoes of them. They weren't bodies or shapes. They were impressions. I asked no question, but the answer came anyway. We are you before the divide. They weren't gods. They were ancestors of thought. A collective mind state, buried not in history, but in us. Why now? I asked, though I hadn't spoken aloud. Because you've begun to listen again. I woke up still hearing the cadence of their language, not with my ears, but in my thoughts. Salah sat beside me, pale but calm. They showed me the split, she said. I nodded. I understood. This wasn't just a lost language. It was the story of something we once shared, and someone had severed it, not because it failed, because it worked too well. 5 months have passed. Salah now lives in northern Finland, far from signals and screens. I stayed behind, but I left academia. Our research vanished from every system it touched. Not overwritten, deleted.
I know this because I tried to pull it back, and it was as if it never existed. I still hear the language, not always in dreams.
Sometimes in moments of stillness, in half-spoken thoughts, in the way silence feels when it's waiting. I've learned to recognize others like me. They pause before speaking. They stare a second too long, like they're hearing two voices. In one sentence, we don't talk about it, we just nod. A quiet acknowledgement. The unity we touched wasn't abstract, it was functional, efficient. A kind of empathy not built through culture but embedded in thought. Somewhere long ago, that system was broken, on purpose. Divide the language, divide the people. But some memory runs too deep to erase. Sometimes before I sleep, I hear a single phrase. It means we are remembered. And when I hear it, I no longer feel fear. I feel understood. They told us the ancients dreamed of healing, but no one asked who was listening on the other side of the dream. For most of my adult life, I've worked in psychiatric research, clinical trials, brain imaging studies, that kind of thing. I've always been more data-driven than spiritual. the kind of person who triple-checks EEG baselines and loses sleep over placebo discrepancies. That's why when the Temple project started, I thought it was just another fringe idea cloaked in academic language. Reconstruction of Asclepian sleep therapy environments was the grant title. In plain English, it meant we were building a replica of an ancient Greek sleep temple inside a controlled neuroscience lab. At first, it felt more theatrical than scientific. Soft stone lighting, aromatherapy, ambient lyre music looping through speakers. But we weren't studying ambience, we were monitoring the effect of dream incubation in these artificially sacred spaces. Volunteers were screened for sleep disorders and emotional trauma. They'd lie on linen-covered slabs while guided imagery played through headphones. The goal was simple: induce symbolic dreams and map their impact on the brain's limbic system. It was surprisingly effective. One patient with chronic grief disorder reported her first dream in years, a serene vision of her late mother guiding her through olive groves. Another, diagnosed with severe anxiety, woke from a session whispering, "It wasn't a dream, it was a memory." We filed the outcomes, adjusted the protocol, and prepared to publish. But then something strange began to happen. Several patients, weeks apart, began to describe nearly identical dreamscapes: a circular stone chamber, a woman in blue robes with no face, a word they couldn't remember upon waking, only the sound
of it, like water running uphill. I thought it was a coincidence. My supervisor, Dr. Rao, suggested cultural leakage, but when I dreamt it too, same chamber, same woman, I stopped laughing it off. I hadn't entered the sleep chamber myself.
Not once. So how had I seen it? I didn't tell anyone at first. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want it to influence the study. Confirmation bias, suggestion. It's easy to muddy the data when you're dealing with dreams. Still that morning, I stayed behind after the team left for coffee and pulled up the internal logs from the neural capture systems. Every patient session was recorded. EEG, heart rate variability, eye movement, and, most importantly, our new tool, a crude dream state transcript compiled from AI analysis of real-time speech and subvocalization during REM. Most entries were vague, metaphor-heavy, sometimes incoherent, but when I searched for specific terms, stone chamber, blue robes, woman, dozens of transcripts lit up, more than I remembered in our official reports. Some went back weeks before the first patient had mentioned the dream aloud. I cross-referenced the timestamps and noticed a pattern. All these dreams occurred between 2:12 and 2:29 a.m., regardless of the participant's sleep onset. And every one of those sessions took place in Chamber 2, the only pod that still used the original limestone imported from Greece before the university's ethics board made us swap it out for synthetic slabs. That detail hadn't seemed important until now. I exported the data to a secure flash drive and went home early, suddenly uneasy in the lab's clinical silence. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified, the refrigerator's hum, a distant dog barking, my own breathing shallow and quick. At 2:13 a.m., without realizing I'd even fallen asleep, I sat bolt upright in bed, not woke, sat, eyes open, heart racing. In my head, I could still hear the sound from the dream, rushing water moving uphill, looping like a chant. I opened my laptop and re-watched one of the dream transcripts, patient 1923. She'd whispered something as she entered REM, barely audible. I cleaned up the audio with some old forensic software I'd used in grad school. Then I played it back. Over and over the same thing. We remember. I don't know why, but it chilled me. It didn't sound like a patient dreaming. It sounded like someone else speaking through her. I spent the next 2 days digging through research archives, academic databases, anything that might give context to what we were seeing. I wasn't looking for folklore or symbolism. I wanted patterns, historical records, something concrete. It turns out sleep temples weren't just spiritual spas for the ancient world. They were engineered environments, stone materials with specific acoustic properties, underground chambers with airflow patterns that mimicked natural caves, and guided rituals designed to lull the patient into a semi-conscious state before sleep. But what stood out were the references to the faceless guide, a recurring figure described in fragmented temple records from Delos, Kos, and Epidaurus. She didn't speak in these accounts, only appeared, always during the second hour of induced sleep, always associated with dreams that were shared across different individuals. It was dismissed as a religious myth, but the parallels were too precise. A 1992 excavation journal from a site in southern Italy mentioned something even more specific. A fresco uncovered in a ruined healing chamber showed a veiled figure surrounded by concentric stone rings. The entry said the figure's face had been deliberately chiseled away in antiquity. Beneath it, an inscription in early Doric Greek, translated loosely to "She comes when the walls remember." That phrase stopped me. I heard "we remember" from that transcript. But this was different. The walls remembering. I searched our own chamber documentation and found something I'd missed before. The limestone used in Chamber 2 was sourced from an old quarry in Epidaurus, less than 2 miles from the original Asclepian site. We had unknowingly recreated the conditions of the oldest sleep temple on record, and the dreams started only after that room came online. I presented some of these findings to Dr. Rao the next morning. I kept it clinical, patterns, timestamps, linguistic links. He listened quietly, then asked if I had spoken to anyone outside the team. I told him no. He nodded and said, "Good. Let's keep it that way." There was a pause, long enough for me to notice something strange in his eyes. Not fear, exactly. Recognition mixed with something quieter. Reluctance. As if this wasn't the first time he'd heard of the faceless woman, but the first time someone else had said it aloud. 3 days later, I drove out to the storage facility where the original limestone slabs from Chamber 2 had been kept before the retrofit. The university had moved them off-site, citing safety concerns. Too heavy, too porous, a liability. But I wanted to see them myself. The facility was on the edge of town, a forgotten complex of windowless storage bays behind a chain-link fence and a keypad gate that still buzzed instead of beeping. The code hadn't changed since grad school. Inside, I found the slabs in a back unit marked as inactive materials. There were no warning signs, no locks, just a tarp folded back over what looked like a row of uneven stone benches. The air inside the unit was heavy with dust, but also something else, a damp,
mineral smell that reminded me of caves.
I pulled out my phone's flashlight and started examining the surface of the nearest slab. At first, it looked like nothing, just worn rock, faint etchings from transport. But when I changed the angle of the light, shallow grooves emerged, rings, concentric and uneven like waves spreading outward. And near the edge, almost hidden in the natural grain, was a symbol. I'd seen it before on one of the EEG scans where the pattern of a patient's brain activity had inexplicably echoed a shape. At the time we thought it was an artifact, noise, but now I was sure it wasn't. I snapped a photo, but the image came out blurred, as if the lens refused to focus on the mark. I tried again, same result. Back at the lab, our digital scanner couldn't map it either. The image kept flattening, losing contrast. I showed it to Emma, our sleep technician, under the pretense of testing the scanner. She stared at it for a long time and said quietly, "It looks familiar." When I asked from where, she hesitated. "I think I saw it in a dream." That's when I noticed something else in the photo's metadata, an embedded audio signature. Our scanner had no microphone, and the camera wasn't configured for ambient pickup. It shouldn't have been possible, unless something had interfered or left an imprint. I extracted the waveform and played it through a noise filter. It was faint, almost drowned in static, but clear enough by the end. A voice, not human, not robotic. Just a single phrase, distorted but unmistakable. Return what was borrowed. That night I backed up everything, transcripts, EEG scans, metadata logs and the audio file, onto a separate encrypted drive. I didn't trust the lab servers anymore. Too many odd file deletions had started happening without explanation. Entire patient logs disappearing, access timestamps that didn't match anyone's schedule. I assumed it was internal cleanup until I found my own credentials used on 2 separate nights. I hadn't even been on campus. I confronted Dr. Rao the next morning, but he brushed it off as a sync error between our remote terminal and the local network. I didn't believe him, and I think he knew it. I started noticing things. A new ID badge appeared on the lab sign-in logs, someone named C. Hoffman, with no institutional affiliation. Emma said she'd seen him once, standing just outside Chamber 2, not doing anything, just staring through the observation window. When she looked again, he was gone. No one else had signed him in. I decided to take the encrypted drive off-site. I'd been emailing with a former professor of mine, Dr. Marina Havel, who now worked independently in applied neuroscience. I hadn't told her much, just that I was seeing anomalous sleep data that didn't map to any known neurological model. She replied with a one-line message. "If you found it, don't send anything digitally. Bring it in person." I booked a train that afternoon. But before I left, I went back into Chamber 2 one last time. It was empty. The walls had been replaced with synthetic stone, the kind that looked real but felt wrong. I walked to the center and stood exactly where each patient had lain. The room was silent, colder than the rest of the building. I didn't fall asleep. I didn't even sit down. But I felt something move through me, not wind, not sound. Just a pressure, like the air had thickened around my head. My ears popped, and then I heard it. Not a voice, but a presence, like being watched by something that had just remembered your name. I left immediately. As I exited, I caught a glimpse of Dr. Rao in the corridor, talking to a man in a dark grey coat. The man glanced at me briefly, not like a stranger, but like someone who'd seen the same signals, like he knew exactly what I'd touched. I arrived at Dr. Havel's converted research flat just after midnight. The building was a repurposed train station on the outskirts of town, thick-walled and quiet, with no sign of modern surveillance. She met me at the door without a word, just a brief nod and a glance at the street behind me. We went inside, where she'd already set up an isolated terminal, air-gapped, no Wi-Fi, no external ports. I handed her the drive. We worked in silence for nearly an hour, scanning each file, verifying signatures, isolating the embedded audio again. Then she played it. This time, she ran the waveform through a different filter, one developed for decoding acoustic hallucinations in patients with temporal lobe epilepsy. What emerged wasn't just the phrase, "return what was borrowed," it was a sequence layered. Beneath it, a frequency pattern matching a rare brainwave state only recorded during deep meditative trances and, oddly, certain pre-death EEGs. She stepped away from the screen and said quietly, "This isn't just a signal, it's entertainment, it's tuning." The words sat heavy between us. She pulled up a separate data set, one I didn't recognize. It was a declassified document from a Cold War era program I'd never heard of, something called the Orpheus Study. She'd collected these records years ago, part of her side project researching unauthorized neurological experiments buried by governments during the late 20th century. It outlined research into using low-frequency sound to induce altered dream states for psychological conditioning. The program had been shut down due to unexpected outcomes. One of the case studies described identical dreams shared across unconnected participants, including symbols matching those etched into our original stone slabs. Dr. Havel looked at me, her face drawn and pale. "They've found this before," she said, "and they buried it." I asked what they were trying to do. She shook her head. "I don't think they were trying to do anything. I think they stumbled onto something already happening. That's come when the power cut out. Not a flicker. Total darkness. A second later, we heard the soft crunch of gravel outside. She grabbed a metal case from beneath the floorboards, handed it to me, and told me to leave through the service tunnel beneath the back stairs. "They don't care about us," she said. "They care about containment." I asked what was in the case. She paused. "The original signal, before it was buried, before they tried to overwrite it." I didn't ask how she had it. I just ran. I stayed off-grid for weeks after that. I moved between short-term rentals, paid in cash, and left no digital trail. The case never left my side. I didn't open it. Not until the night I knew I couldn't carry it any further. I was staying in an old farmhouse a few miles outside a town no one visits on purpose. No internet, no neighbors close enough to hear anything. That night, something changed. I woke up just before 2:13 a.m. No alarm, no sound. Just that same pressure in the air I'd felt in Chamber 2, like the air around me was holding its breath. I sat at the edge of the bed, opened the case, and found a small, solid-state drive, a paper notebook filled with spectral diagrams, and a single page torn from an older document. It showed the original source frequency, the one recorded before the modern temple project even began. According to the notes, it had been captured inside a cave beneath the Epidaurus ruins during an illegal excavation in 1981. The waveform was nearly identical to our own signal, but inverted, as if it had always been there, waiting to be heard, in reverse. That's when it finally made sense. The dreams weren't hallucinations or artifacts, they were responses. The limestone, the rituals, even the architectural layout of the chambers, they weren't designed to create healing. They were designed to receive something, to amplify it. Every time someone entered that space and entered REM sleep, it was like a signal boost, a call across time and consciousness, and someone, or something, was still listening. I burned the documents the next morning. Not out of fear, but because I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't about exposure, it wasn't about stopping a conspiracy or warning the world. It was older than that, quieter. The ancients hadn't built those chambers to heal, they'd built them to listen. And over time they forgot what they were listening for. What had been borrowed wasn't ours to keep. Maybe it never was. Maybe we'd simply turned into something that was never meant to be heard clearly. And now the signal had found its way back. I left the case on the stone floor of a decommissioned church outside Thessaloniki. No note, no message. Just the faint hum of something old resuming its rhythm. I live quietly now. I still dream, but not like before. The woman in blue never returned. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see the chamber, the rings, the silence, the stillness beneath the stone. And I wonder if the healing they spoke of was never meant for us. It started the night I dreamed of a train crash in 1912 and woke to find the name of a station that never existed scrawled in my journal. I didn't remember my dreams. They'd vanished like steam off a mirror, gone before my second cup of coffee. But something shifted the month I turned 35. I can't explain it, only that I began waking with vivid layered memories, dreams that came with names, dates, even smells. It felt harmless at first. I started keeping a journal beside the bed, half out of curiosity, half as a way to track how strange things had gotten. I'd jot down what I saw: Victorian alleyways, rusted submarines, old men in hats whispering under gaslight. I figured it was just the stress of work or too much late-night history podcasts. That is, until the names started matching real people. People I'd never studied or read about. People I couldn't have known. There was one entry, January 12th. I dreamed of a library fire in Paris and saw a man drop a leather-bound book into a well. The next day, on a whim, I searched for the date. I found a news clipping. A small fire had broken out in the archives of a university building. No injuries, but several rare books were reportedly missing. It was odd, sure, but still not enough to convince me of anything beyond coincidence. It was the fifth or sixth dream that changed things. In it, I watched a woman step off a platform, her suitcase marked Gateshead 1912. The train never arrived. When I woke, I'd scribbled a strange phrase. Southmore derailment, March 2th. I typed it into my search bar, expecting nothing. But there it was, a forgotten crash, buried in local archives. The article was blurry, like the scan had been warped. But it was real. That was the first time I felt it. The cold flicker of something watching me back. It wasn't long before I heard from the others. a comment on a blog I barely used, an encrypted message in a dream journal subreddit. People like me, dreaming of the past. Only their dreams weren't just dreams. They were corrections. They called themselves the Chrono Scribes. The message came through a secure chat room, buried deep in a forum for lucid dreamers. It was short, precise, and unsettling. We've seen Southmore too. We need to talk. Password, Arkwell. At first, I hesitated. I didn't know who was on the other end. But something about the phrasing, the quiet confidence, the use of the word "we" hooked into that part of me that already knew this wasn't isolated. I typed in the password and was directed to a private thread. The group called themselves the Chrono Scribes. Their profiles were anonymous, but their language carried the same eerily specific details I'd been writing in my journal for weeks. One user, Sable Truth, shared a dream about the 1849 fire in St. Louis, claiming he had written about a dock worker named Pritchard minutes before finding that exact name in a municipal death ledger scanned into an obscure university archive. Another, Index Ash, referenced a recurring dream where she rode in the passenger seat of a Model T, listening to a song on the radio that wasn't recorded until 1925, 10 years after the date carved into the dashboard. They weren't random fantasies. They were coherent fragments of impossible history. I spent days reading their logs, matching their entries against real-world events. Each time, a pattern emerged, small historical shifts, events that had been documented one way but now appeared differently in archives or articles. An ambassador's name was changed. A factory closure moved from 1907 to 1905. The kind of details no one would question unless they'd seen it both ways. The group believed dream journaling wasn't just observation, it was an influence. Not immediately, not on demand, but somehow, through the act of recording, we were rewriting the past, quietly, slowly. Sable Truth called it timeline sediment. The idea that enough alterations recorded with enough clarity could build up pressure and shift history like tectonic plates. It sounded insane, but I couldn't deny what I'd seen, especially after I looked through my old journals. A March 9th entry about a missing steamboat, the Line. At the time, nothing came up in my research, but last week when I searched again, I found a museum entry, the Line. Sank 1872, Mississippi River. 2 passengers survived. One name stood out, G. Holden, a name I'd never read, but somehow had written down months before. That's when I realized something even more troubling. I wasn't just changing the past was beginning to remember me. It was Sable Truth who suggested we keep duplicate records, one physical, one digital, and store them separately. He said it was the only way to track what he called temporal drift. At first, I didn't see the point. My entries were already detailed, time-stamped, and backed up across cloud storage and flash drives, but then the discrepancies started showing up. A word missing here, a date altered there. Subtle, like editing errors, but always in the digital versions. I compared one dream, an account of a Berlin clock tower being removed in 1938, against both my handwritten and typed notes. The paper journal described the tower's demolition in vivid detail, right down to the initials carved into the limestone. The digital copy, no mention of it. In fact, It referenced a completely different dream from the same night. I hadn't written that version, not consciously. I confronted the others in the forum. Index Ash confirmed similar anomalies. Entire entries rewritten, locations changed, names lost or swapped, but only digitally. It was as if something or someone was cleaning up behind us, shaping what remained visible in the record. That's when the deeper research began. The chronoscribes weren't new, not exactly. We traced the idea back to obscure references in declassified files from the 1970s. There were mentions of a DARPA-funded project called Meridian Path, supposedly focused on cognitive forecasting. But in one heavily redacted memo, we found a phrase that hit like a bolt. Temporal coding embedded via REM cycle narrative structuring. It wasn't a dream theory, it was a system, a way to encode changes through imagination itself. What disturbed me most wasn't that someone had tried to do this, it was the thought that they might have succeeded. The name Arkwell turned up in those documents too, listed under a section labelled long-form field agents. According to one footnote, they were tasked not with observing, but with anchoring changes in collective memory through repeated documentation. The more we found, the clearer it became. We weren't stumbling onto a secret. We were replicating a method. And whatever we were altering, it was starting to respond. My dreams began shifting tone, less historical, more personal. Familiar places twisted out of time. My father is alive again, but speaking French. A birthday party I never had, held inside a 1930s bank. They weren't dreams. They were rewrites. And I was losing track of which version of my life was real. The meeting point was a decommissioned printing facility in upstate New York, chosen by Sabletooth for its isolation and the fact that it hadn't had a functioning power grid since the late 90s. No cameras, no cell signal, and no digital trace if we kept our devices off. I drove 6 hours to get there, bringing only my paper journals and a flashlight. The place looked as forgotten as advertised, broken windows, rusted signage, and a moss-covered loading dock that sagged under my boots. Inside, the air was cold and metallic, thick with the scent of oil and old ink. I found them near the main press room, Sabletooth, Index Ash, and a third person who introduced himself only as Fen. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 20s, with the quiet focus of someone who had seen too much too fast. We didn't waste time on introductions. We spread out our journals on a long wooden workbench stained with years of forgotten ink, lining up dates and entries. Side by side, the patterns jumped out, repeated phrases across unrelated dreams, locations that matched on dates none of us had previously shared. Most chilling of all were the handwriting samples. One entry in each of our journals had been written in identical script, neat and looping, like something copied from an old textbook. None of us remembered writing those pages. They're artifacts, Fen said, pointing to the matching entries. Implanted records. They don't just reflect what we've dreamed, they anchor it. He pulled a worn manila folder from his bag, revealing a set of photocopied documents. Military, memos, classified field notes, and a grainy photograph of a wall covered in pinned notebook pages. The caption beneath read, Chronoscribe Variants, Site 9. One memo referenced static bleed, a term used to describe the side effects of timeline interference manifesting in physical locations, places where memory and history had fractured. so deeply they created echoes, buildings that never existed, rooms filled with objects that had no origin. I didn't want to believe it, but then Fen led us to the basement. We stepped through a rusted door and descended a staircase caked in dust. The floor below had once stored reams of paper and ink drums, but now it was empty, except for a single desk. On it sat a dream journal. My journal. Same leather cover, same bookmark, even the same indentation from where I rest my thumb when I write. I flipped it open. The first page was dated tomorrow, and it was written in my handwriting. We burned the journal, not out of fear, but to see if it would return. Fen insisted it would. He'd seen it happen before, entries reappearing weeks later in drawers, lockers, even postmarked to his apartment without a return address. "That's how you know you're in the stream," he said, eyes reflecting the flicker of the fire. "Once you interfere, it finds ways to reinsert what was meant to be recorded." After that night, we stopped posting publicly. The forum was abandoned, threads wiped, accounts deactivated. From then on, we communicated using burner devices and handwritten drop points arranged across different cities. My instructions were clear: write nightly, hide your journal, and change the hiding place every week. I followed them without question, but still things began to slip. I'd wake to find fresh ink on pages I didn't remember writing. Entire entries appeared in my voice, using phrases I recognized, describing events I'd never dreamed. And then, 3 days after the journal burning, a package arrived at my door. No name, no address, just a plain box with a small symbol drawn on the top corner, a closed eye. Inside was a stack of printed documents. Not copies of my journal entries, but historical records, news clippings, census sheets, even photographs, all altered. My handwriting was scrawled in the margins, circling names, correcting dates, crossing out events that, as far as I could tell, no longer happened. In one photo, a woman stood beside a 1940s train car, wearing a pin I recognized from a dream I'd written weeks earlier. She was holding a notebook. The caption read, "Arkwell Agent, undated." That's when I realized we were being monitored, not in the traditional sense, but through the changes we were making. Every altered entry was a signal, every correction a pulse. The stream, as Fen called it, wasn't random. It was being tracked. 2 nights later, I caught someone outside my apartment. I didn't hear them, but I felt it. The shift in the air, the stillness in the hallway. My journals were gone. The lockbox I kept under the floorboard had been removed cleanly, no damage, no mess. Just a single scrap of paper left in its place. On it, in my own handwriting, were 6 words. "Do not write tomorrow. Do not." I stared at that message for hours, trying to decide whether to listen. But when morning came, I opened a blank page and started writing. Because the truth was, I no longer knew what part of me was choosing. The page I wrote that morning didn't come from me. I watched the words take shape beneath my pen, but it felt like transcribing something already decided, not something I was thinking. The date I wrote, March 14th, 1891, was unfamiliar, but the scene was not. A cobblestone street lined with iron lanterns, the air thick with smoke, a procession of men in identical coats walking toward a factory entrance that hadn't existed for a century. I described the sound of a brass whistle, the glint of something reflective in the window of an upper floor, and the sudden collapse of a scaffold before the dream faded. That night, I received a message from Index Ash through a shared dead drop in Boston. Confirmed. That factory fire never happened. But
now it has a record. You're imprinting. The fallout came quickly. Fen vanished first.
we checked his drops, his apartment, every backup line. Nothing. His journals, the ones we'd stored at the safe site, had all been wiped, blank pages where thousands of dreams had once been logged. Sable Truth was next. His final message, simply, "Read. We were never meant to interfere this often. They're consolidating." The meaning was unclear until I saw the first mirror fragment. In a museum archive database I hadn't accessed before, I found an article on the Southmore derailment, the dream that started all of this. But now, instead of a minor accident, it has become a full-scale disaster with a confirmed death toll. One of the victims listed was Gregory Holden. That name had been mine in a dream 2 months prior. I cross-checked census data and found a Holden family line that hadn't existed before. It traced directly to a woman alive today in Chicago, one who shared my mother's maiden name. The identities were merging. Past and present were folding together like overlapping transparencies, and I was part of both. I wasn't just writing dreams anymore, I was entering them. Feeling things I couldn't have lived through, recalling names, addresses, habits of people who died decades before I was born. One night, I woke with dirt under my fingernails and a train ticket in my jacket pocket. It was dated 1912. The station no longer exists. But it did, because I wrote it, because I made it real. And now I couldn't undo what I'd set in motion. I moved into a small apartment above a closed bookshop in a town where no one knew my name, no phone, no Wi-Fi, no digital trace. The journals are stored in a locked cabinet lined with lid sheets, a precaution Fenn once mentioned in passing, claiming certain materials disrupted the resonance bleed. Whether it works or not, I don't know. But the entries have stopped changing, at least for now. I still write, though less often. The dreams haven't stopped, but they've quieted. Shorter, dimmer, like echoes instead of broadcasts. Sometimes I'll see a name I remember or a street that shouldn't exist anymore and feel the pull, the old temptation to document, to correct, to reach backward. But I resist, not because I'm afraid of what might happen, but because I finally understand what we were doing. We weren't time travelers. We were editors, annotators of a reality that was never fixed to begin with. Each dream, each entry, was a vote cast in a silent referendum on the shape of history. And too many votes in one direction break the page. Sable Truth was right. We were replicating a method, but not one we invented. We were vessels, and the act of remembering was how it spread. Not a virus in the biological sense, something older, slower, carried not in blood, but in memory. And once we wrote it down, we made it legible, reproducible, infectious. I still think about Fenn, about the day we found that journal dated tomorrow. I wonder if he knew his own story was already over, that he was reading the final chapter before it was lived. I've stopped asking where the stream begins or ends. That part doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I'm still here. I
carry the weight of 2 timelines, maybe more. I see my face in places I've never been. I know things I shouldn't know, but I've made peace with that.
Because whatever we altered, whatever we left behind, someone will find it. Maybe they already have. And when they do, I hope they read this. I hope they understand. The past isn't behind us. It's beneath us, layered and fragile. And every word we write is another breath against the glass. They said it could heal grief, but the first time I heard it, something else woke up inside me. I didn't believe in sound therapy or ancient tones, not really. As a freelance audio engineer, I spent my days cleaning up scratchy old interviews or designing podcast jingles, nothing mystical about that. But then, about 3 months ago, a client sent me something different. A dusty reel of tape marked only with one word: melancholy. No artist, no label, no dates. I almost tossed it in the drawer with the other weird submissions. But curiosity won out. That night I threaded the tape onto my deck and let it run while I made dinner. The moment the frequency came through the speakers, I felt it. Not just in my ears, but in my chest, my stomach, my jaw. A deep, low vibration that didn't shake the air so much as the space inside me. My eyes burned, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I started crying. Not the kind of tears you can brush off. They felt like they'd been waiting for years. The sound was simple, a slowly pulsing tone like a stretched-out cello note. But something about its pitch, its rhythm, the
air it carried,
it bypassed my brain entirely. After 10 minutes I stopped the tape. My hands were shaking. My dinner was untouched. I didn't sleep well that night, kept hearing echoes of the tone in the back of my head, like a memory just out of reach. The next morning, I digitized the audio and ran it through my usual analysis tools. No anomalies. But the frequency, it wasn't standard. It hovered somewhere between 111 and 113 Hz, a range just below normal musical tuning. Technically inaudible to most ears, but this was different. It was felt, not just heard. I posted a short clip on a private sound engineering forum to see if anyone else had come across something like it. Within hours, 3 users messaged me. One said the sound helped his panic attacks vanish for a week. Another claimed her dreams became lucid. The third simply wrote, "I saw my father again." That's when I realized this wasn't just some forgotten demo. This sound had a pull to it, a purpose. And I wasn't the first person to find it. But I might have been the first in a long time, maybe the first in decades, maybe even longer. The clip didn't stay private for long. Within 48 hours, someone re-uploaded it to a wellness subreddit, calling it the healing tone you can feel. From there, it spiraled, shared in audio blogs, meditation groups, then eventually by fringe forums dedicated to ancient sound rituals. I kept my name off everything, but I watched closely. One post caught my attention more than the others. A grainy video from a man who claimed the tone helped him remember things he'd forgotten since childhood. Not just vague feelings, specifics, names, dates, voices. He sat in a cluttered garage, pale and shaking, and said he remembered a wooden room and a woman with a red scarf humming the exact same pitch. He said he was 6 years old in the memory.
He hadn't thought of that woman in decades. That detail sat with me, not because it was strange, plenty of people claim false memories under suggestion, but because I'd had something similar.
After listening to the tone again, a memory surfaced I hadn't thought about since I was a kid. My mother used to hum something while washing dishes, always at dusk. I hadn't remembered the melody until now, and when I tried to hum it back, it matched the tone almost perfectly. That night, I pulled the waveform into a frequency spectrogram and isolated the harmonic structure. It wasn't just a single tone, it pulsed with a secondary frequency, something faint, like a buried whisper. When I enhanced the lows, a pattern emerged, not speech, not quite, but something rhythmic and repeating. I sent the clip to a sound researcher I knew from university, Dr. Elsie Marrow, someone I hadn't spoken to in years but who owed me a favor. Her reply came a few hours later. "Where did you get this?" That was all. I called her immediately. She didn't pick up. Instead, she texted, "Do not send this to anyone else. I'll explain in person." We met 2 days later at Eat, a coffee shop off a highway exit an hour out of town. She looked older, tired in a way academia doesn't usually cause. She didn't say hello, just opened her laptop and showed me an audio file labeled G09 Arch to tone.wav. It was identical to mine, same frequency range, same buried pulse. She said it was recorded in 1983, taken from a stone chamber, unearthed during a site excavation in Anatolia. She said no one could explain the origin. The room where it was found was designed to echo only this frequency, and it was older than anything that should have had acoustic intention. She called it the melancholy frequency. Not a nickname, a label. Like it had always existed, waiting to be heard. Elsie didn't want to talk in public. She handed me a flash drive beneath the table, the way someone might pass a note in a high school class, casual on the outside, but her hands were shaking. We drove separately to her place, a quiet 2-story outside of town with blackout curtains and no visible router. Inside, she walked me through a folder of research files, each one labeled by location and year. Cappadocia, 1983. Sardinia, 1997. Newfoundland, 2009. At first glance, they looked like ordinary field reports, but each contained the same anomaly. Buried chambers built in perfect acoustic proportion to the melancholy frequency. No tools had been found, no cultural link between sites, yet every chamber was tuned the same way. "These aren't tombs," she said, "they're instruments." Her research suggested that certain rooms could shape sound the same way a flute shapes breath. Deliberate resonance, focused emotion. What made the melancholy frequency unique, she said, was its effect on memory. It didn't implant ideas or erase them. It released what was already there, feelings we'd buried, truths we'd chosen not to see. The most chilling part came next. She opened a folder titled Patient Response Logs. These weren't just lab studies, they were therapy sessions, real people, real outcomes. One man, a combat veteran, listened to a 30-second clip and broke down into uncontrollable sobs. He remembered a face he couldn't place, his brother, presumed dead, but whose features matched a photo from a declassified intelligence file dated 3 years after the supposed death. Another subject described remembering a different version of their childhood. Not a dream, but something more tactile, like discovering your house had a hidden room you'd lived in, but forgotten. The logs showed consistent neural activity, Subjects exhibited synchronized surges in the hippocampus and the anterior cingulate cortex, the parts of the brain that process emotion and resolve cognitive dissonance. In simpler terms, the tone made people confront things they had hidden from themselves. Some experienced healing, others spiraled. A few became obsessed. One researcher went missing 3 weeks after requesting funding to conduct a large-scale exposure study. Elsie showed me the proposal. It included my waveform copied from the clip I'd posted. That's when I realized someone else had been watching the forums too. "This frequency doesn't just unlock memory," she said quietly. "It unlocks belief. And belief is the foundation of everything." The building didn't appear on any current maps, but Elsie had an archived land record that traced it back to a decommissioned sanatorium listed under a historical foundation with no digital presence. We drove 4 hours to reach it, cutting through dense pine forest until the road dissolved into gravel and then into nothing. The structure sat in a clearing like it had been forgotten on purpose. 4 stories of weather-worn brick, its windows boarded or broken, the roof sagging slightly in the center. Elsie had been there once before, years ago, when she first started researching acoustic anomalies in early 20th century architecture. Back then she hadn't known what to listen for. Now she brought a field recorder, 2 microphones, and a low-frequency resonance meter. Inside, the building was silent except for the creak of the wood beneath our feet. Peeling wallpaper revealed older, hand-painted patterns, repeating geometric shapes arranged in spirals and nested squares. Elsie stopped in the center of the main corridor and pulled out the recorder. She played the melancholy frequency through a directional speaker, slowly rotating it as she scanned the walls. That's when we heard it, a subtle vibration, not loud, but distinct, echoing back only when the speaker faced north. We followed it through collapsed hallways and a stairwell half swallowed by mold. On the 3rd floor, behind a collapsed filing cabinet and a locked door rusted off its hinges, we found the room. It was octagonal, panelled in dark wood that felt unnaturally smooth. At the centre was a circular depression in the floor, barely 2 inches deep, surrounded by carvings that weren't decorative. Each groove matched the wave pattern of the frequency down to the decimal. Elsie activated the meter. The reading pulsed at 112.3 Hz without playback. No speakers, no source. It was already here, humming beneath the floor, like the building itself was breathing. She reached into her bag and pulled out an old reel marked Mirror. This was recorded. Here in 1968, she said. They called it a music therapy pilot program. She threaded the reel onto a portable deck and hit play. The tone filled the room, not loud, not aggressive, just present. Within seconds, I felt a rush of pressure in my chest, not pain, just memory, uninvited and raw. I saw a street I hadn't walked since I was 8. My father standing in the rain, holding something I'd forgotten he ever gave me. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real, precise, vivid. I looked at Elsie. Her eyes were already closed, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. We didn't speak on the drive back. Neither of us had the words. What we experienced in that room was more than memory. It felt structural, like something foundational had shifted. Elsie looked pale, distant, her hands twitching slightly on the steering wheel. When I asked her what she saw, she just shook her head. and said, something I'd convinced myself never happened. I didn't push. The next day, I backed up every file we had onto 3 separate encrypted drives and mailed them to addresses I trusted. Not because I was planning to go public, but because I could feel the walls tightening. That night, a message appeared on my private forum account. No username, no subject, just one sentence. Some sounds were buried for a reason. I didn't respond. I deleted it, wiped the logs, shut down my rig, and left the apartment. At Elsie's suggestion, we met again in person. She was visibly shaken. Someone had accessed her institutional research portal using her credentials at 2 a.m. Nothing was stolen, but a document had been opened, one she hadn't touched in years. It was a proposal titled Resonant Human Encoding, Ancient Acoustic Structures, and the Persistence of Identity. She hadn't written it. But her name was on it, and the metadata traced back to a university server she no longer had clearance for. That night, we agreed to stop, to shut it all down. But curiosity is harder to silence than fear. I played the frequency again, alone, in my studio, but this time I embedded it beneath ambient noise, masked it under a synthesized soundscape to see if it still had effect. It did. The next morning, I had 6 emails from people who downloaded the track. 3 wrote about emotional clarity. One said he relieved his mother's last words in perfect detail. One woman said she wept for 20 minutes and didn't know why, but felt better after. The last message was different. It came with an audio attachment labeled Reply WAV. I opened it, expecting feedback or some improvised loop. But it wasn't music. It was the melancholy frequency, slightly altered, pitched, higher, layered with a second tone I hadn't included, and beneath it, just barely, was a voice. Not spoken words, not in any language I could identify, but it carried rhythm, intent, something beyond imitation. I stared at the waveform for an hour. It looked familiar, almost like the same embedded signal I had found weeks ago. Only this one had changed, adapted, as if it was responding. I sent the altered file to Elsie without a message. 5 minutes later, she called me. No greeting, just urgency in her voice. "That's not an echo," she said. "It's a construct. Someone or something is building on the original signal." She walked me through a quick comparison. The new frequency wasn't just altered, it was layered with information in a structure she called recursive encoding, meaning it carried data that changed depending on who listened. A fingerprinted response, a mirror. I didn't understand all the science, but the implication was clear. The signal wasn't just being received, it was now engaging. That night, Elsie forwarded me 3 documents she hadn't planned to share. They were from a closed acoustic research program, funded briefly in the 1970s, one of those projects that came and went without trace. Their focus was the emotional resonance of sound in megalithic structures, Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe, the Hypogeum in Malta. The researchers had discovered frequencies embedded in the stone that mirrored the melancholy tone. But more disturbingly, they found biological anomalies in those exposed to prolonged playback, elevated neural conductivity, memory clarity beyond normative thresholds, And in one case, a subject began speaking in a language no one recognized, complete with grammar, structure, and syntax. The program was shut down 6 weeks later. All participants were relocated. The paper trail ended there. Elsie didn't know what had happened to them. 2 nights later, my apartment was broken into. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged. Just a single USB drive placed carefully on my desk. It contained one file, a screen recording of my waveform editor, open to the original melancholy frequency. The cursor hovered over a frequency band I hadn't explored before. When I isolated it, I found a subharmonic structure nested deep in the low end, below 10 Hz infrasound, the kind of tone that bypasses conscious hearing entirely and goes straight to the body. It was a message, but not a warning. It felt like a key. When I played the file with that subharmonic activated, I blacked out. For 12 minutes, according to the time code. No memory, no sensation, just a blank span. When I came to, the screen showed a new track layered beneath the old one. It had written itself, or I had written it in some unconscious state. I ran a spectrogram and froze. The waveform matched an ancient symbol I had seen only once before in a carved stone pattern inside the sanatorium. This was no longer just
sound, it was designed. And I was no longer an observer, I was part of it. I left everything behind 2 days later. The studio, the files, the backups I thought I'd hidden well. It didn't matter anymore. Whatever I was part of, it had already
moved beyond me. I stayed in motion, changing cities, sleeping in motels, avoiding anything that could connect me to my former life. I tried not to listen to any recordings, not even the background music in restaurants or the buzz of streetlights, because once you've heard it, really heard it, the melancholy frequency begins to emerge from everything. It finds you. In footsteps, in distant engines, in the hum of power lines. And when it does, it brings pieces with it. Memories, images, fragments of knowledge that feel both deeply personal and impossibly ancient. I started seeing patterns in architecture, proportions in everyday buildings that matched the frequency's waveform. I walked through a train station in Budapest and knew, without doubt, that its domed ceiling had been constructed to resonate with a specific harmonic of the tone. Not a coincidence, not art, design. There were others like me. I noticed them by how they moved, how their heads would tilt at the same angle when passing certain sounds. We never spoke. We didn't have to. There was a kind of recognition in the silence. I found one of them outside an abandoned observatory in Spain, standing in front of a wall and tracing a spiral onto the stone with her finger. When she turned, her eyes met mine and she whispered, "It's not a memory. It's a reminder." I understood. The truth I'd uncovered, the thing that changed everything. It wasn't about sound healing or lost civilizations or neurological anomalies. It was about resonance. Resonance not just in the auditory sense, but emotional, psychological, even historical. The melancholy frequency was a thread woven through time, connecting those moments in which humanity remembered what it had chosen to forget, where we came from, what we were meant to become, and why it had all been buried. I don't share the recordings anymore. I don't post on forums. I don't investigate. I listen. Not because I'm trying to understand, but because now I know the signal was never meant to be decoded. It was meant to awaken. And once awakened, you don't go back. You carry it. In your thoughts, in your bones, in the way you feel when silence isn't truly silent anymore. Some nights when I lie still enough, I can hear it again. Faint, layered, beneath the world. And I think about the first time I played that tape and how it felt like something woke up inside me. I understand now that something was always there, waiting. They say we forget 95% of our dreams. I've started remembering too much. Most nights I sleep like anyone else. 8 hours, give or take, lights out, no interruptions. But a few months ago, something shifted. It began with a dream so detailed. I wrote it down the second I woke up. A building, massive, windowless, stood in a landscape that never turned fully dark. Inside were spiral staircases and narrow halls, all leading to a round, vaulted room filled with shelves. No fear, just the feeling that I'd been expecting. At first, I thought it was just a vivid dream, maybe a memory from a museum visit or something I'd seen in passing. But then I went back. Night after night, picking up where I'd left off. Not a repeat, not a redreaming, a continuation. That's when I noticed the books. I could read them, I remembered them. And what I remembered didn't make sense. Foreign treaties I'd never studied. Obscure dialects. Pre-internet history too obscure to find online. I tested it, looked things up the next day, and they were real. Verbatim. Places, dates, facts. I didn't tell anyone, not at first. What would I say? Hey, I've been visiting a dream library that updates every night. So I started documenting everything myself. Just a journal. Titles I read, phrases that stuck out, observations about the space itself, especially the librarians who never moved their mouths when they spoke. But then 2 weeks ago, something changed. When I arrived, the books were sealed shut, not
Locked. Exactly. Just unavailable. Every cover was smooth and blank. And for the first time, I heard a voice. Not in the room. Not even in my ears. Just behind my thoughts, calm, certain. Not yet. That was the first moment I felt uneasy. Not because the voice sounded threatening, but because it sounded like it had always been there. I didn't mean to start researching, but after the voice, I couldn't leave it alone. I started where anyone would, online. I looked into dream studies, lucid dreaming, anything fringe but grounded. Most of it was harmless fluff, but buried. In old forums and obscure subreddits were fragments of something familiar. People describing circular rooms, silent guides and shelves that extended out of view. A few even used the same phrase I'd written in my journal without thinking. The Nocturnal Library. Different usernames, years apart, no obvious connection. But the tone, the rhythm, felt oddly aligned. I copied everything into a folder. Out of curiosity, I ran a linguistic analysis across the entries, not to prove anything, just to see. And the phrasing, not copied, but consistent. Cadence, structure, sentence logic, like different people trying to describe the same dream using the same internal framework. I messaged a few of them. Most accounts were inactive. One bounced back, but one replied. Her name was Mila. Her message was brief.
I thought I was the only one. Do you remember the ink that moves? I hadn't told anyone about that, the way the text sometimes shimmered on the page like it was still forming. That one question told me she'd seen it too. We started comparing notes. She was methodical, former linguist, trained in cognition and symbolic structure. She said the library had once been open to her, fully accessible. But something had changed. Now I find empty books, she told me, or titles that vanish mid-sentence, like it's editing itself. It reminded me of what I'd seen, books that looked familiar one night and unreadable the next. Mila said she was cataloguing everything by hand. Her digital copies kept disappearing. I didn't take her seriously until mine did too. One night I went to review my notes. The document was gone, not deleted, never saved. The recovery. Folders were empty, as if the file had never existed. That night in the library, I found a single book waiting for me. No title, just a black cover and a line etched in faint silver. You are being watched. I spent days deep in archives, old newspapers, government records, academic journals that
hadn't been digitized. I wasn't chasing the dream anymore. I was looking for the footprint it might have left behind. And I started to find it. Not proof, but fragments. A physicist in 1971 who claimed to see libraries in his sleep and later
sketched pages from books that hadn't yet been published. A Cold War-era intelligence report about a civilian who accessed operational data during dreams. Official language, vague but familiar. I flagged over 24 accounts, all consistent with what Mila and I had seen. She was ahead of me. She sent a scanned page from one of her notebooks, a translated excerpt from a dream book she'd copied by hand. It described something called the threshold of collective recall, a limit to how much shared knowledge can exist in a dream space before it begins to push back. The library is not a place of human origin, the text read. It is offered to us conditionally, governed by a force that decides what may be retained. Mila had underlined one line. Access is contingent on conduct. We started to realize this wasn't just memory, it was a system, something reactive, something with rules. The voice I'd heard, not yet, wasn't dismissive, it was instructional. Mila believed we were being tested, that our behavior, both in and out of the library, affected what we were allowed to see. It's not punishing, she said once, but it is watching, and maybe adjusting. That night I returned again. The books were still sealed, but near the central chamber I saw something new. A mirror, freestanding, thin, framed in silver. When I looked into it, I didn't see myself. I saw someone I didn't recognize. And for a second, they looked back at me before I could react. That was the first time I wondered if someone else was sharing my access. The building looked like nothing, an old municipal records office, long closed, brick peeling under years of weather. I'd driven by it for years without ever thinking twice, but a line from one of the old documents Mila had sent kept circling back. Dream cartographers used forgotten archives to ground their access. I wasn't sure what it meant until I pulled the address from a footnote in a declassified report. I went there the next day. The back door was rusted but loose. Inside, the air was stale and metallic, like it hadn't moved in decades. Most of the rooms were gutted, but deep in the back I found something intact. A small, windowless room with steel cabinets and a desk bolted to the floor. One drawer was open. Inside, hundreds of index cards, typed, yellowed, organized by hand. Each listed a name, a date, and something else, fragments of dream content. Some descriptions were identical to mine, others matched Mila's exactly. I flipped through them in silence. A few were stamped, observed. Others had been labeled revoked. This wasn't research, it was monitoring, and I had no doubt the cards were real. One referenced a dream Mila had mentioned to me offhand, about a librarian who had no eyes and a corner of the room where sound disappeared. She'd never written that down, but it was here. I took photos quickly. As I packed up, I noticed something faintly scratched into the surface of the metal desk, hidden beneath dust and oxidation. The library listens. I left in silence, trying not to rush. That night, for the first time in weeks, I didn't dream.
No library. No voice. Nothing. When I checked my locked drawer the next morning, my journal was gone. In its place was a single page, blank except for one sentence. Your behavior is under review. After the journal vanished, I stopped pretending.
This was all theoretical. That one piece of paper, your behavior is under review, shifted everything. It wasn't just that someone had breached a locked drawer in a locked room. It was that they knew exactly what mattered most to me. I considered pulling back, logging
off, letting it go, but I couldn't. Not when Mila sent her next message, a single photo of her hand holding a small brass key and the caption, failsafe, just in case.
We had once joked about creating a fallback location, a place offline, low-tech, untraceable. A remote cabin on the edge of the grid. It was just talk. But apparently she had followed through. Her message came with coordinates and one sentence. If they cut me off, you'll know. I asked what she meant. She didn't reply. The next day, her entire digital presence vanished. Email bounced. Files were dead links. Her phone rang twice, then disconnected. Her name was scrubbed from shared.
Folders like it had never been there.
I waited 3 days before using the coordinates. The cabin was real, isolated, silent, just as she'd described. Inside I found a flashlight, a sealed folder, and a voice recorder already running. Her voice came through the speaker in a calm,
measured tone. If you're hearing this, they've shut me out. The library is still accessible, but it's curated differently now, restricting, reacting. The more we share, the more it closes. But when we act without speaking, when we move,
with purpose, it allows more. I played the message twice and I opened the folder. Inside were scans of brain imagery, old research notes, and documents from intelligence agencies I won't name. The patterns were unmistakable. People like us, readers, exhibited measurable neurological changes. No damage, not deterioration. Something adaptive. Brain structures growing in directions they weren't supposed to. Mila's final line in the recorder stayed with me. It's not about accessing knowledge, it's about becoming something it recognizes. That night, I returned to the dream, but not to the library. I was in a cold, featureless space. On the table was a single book, open to one line etched into the page like metal. This is not a gift, it is a test. The next morning, my hands were shaking. I had bite marks on the inside of my cheek and blood dried along my molars. Whatever that dream was, it hadn't been peaceful. My first instinct was to burn the folder, to cut ties, but I didn't. I catalogued everything, locked it in a weatherproof case, and buried it beneath the floorboards. Mila's findings weren't just observations, they were proof. And they terrified me. Back home, I reconnected the dots. Her notes showed that every major spike in dream access was followed by a reduction in public discourse, people going silent, studies disappearing, even sleep labs quietly shutting down. The library, it seemed, didn't just limit access. It erased patterns it didn't approve of. What worried me most was a page marked in red. Phase drift. According to Mila, once the library began limiting interaction, users would stop dreaming entirely. Some experienced complete sensory flattening. No smell, no taste, no emotional highs or lows. Just muted awareness. One called it mental grey out. A week passed, then 2. I didn't return to the library, not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. Every night was a blank space. No dreams, no noise, just the feeling of something listening from just outside reach. Then the final sign came. In a second-hand bookstore 3 towns over, buried in a copy of a history textbook, I found a single page, torn, folded, my handwriting, from the journal that had disappeared. One line at the center. To remember is to be responsible. I stared at it for a long time, not scared, not confused, just resigned. The library hadn't deleted everything, it had chosen what to return. I don't know what that means exactly, but I understood what I had to do. I started scattering what I knew, splitting files, mailing physical copies to people who didn't know each other, writing under new names in languages I don't speak, natively. Not to warn anyone, but to keep the pattern incomplete, to keep it from noticing. It's been months now, and I haven't returned. The dreams remain blank. My thoughts have started to thin out, just slightly. I forget names more easily. Certain tastes seem muted. Music sounds flatter than I remember. I'm not losing my mind, but something's pulling me further from it. I've stopped using digital devices for anything important. I keep notes in hardbound ledgers, hidden in places I sometimes forget. I've relocated again. No forward address, no paper trail. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, faintly. The library, not calling exactly, but present. Like the pressure behind silence. I don't think it's done with me. I think it's waiting, maybe for a change in behavior, maybe just to see what I do next. I've accepted that I won't know. As for Mila, I don't believe she's gone, not in the usual sense. I think she passed whatever test we were part of, or maybe she was absorbed into it, not erased, but rewritten. I wonder sometimes if she's the one curating now. If the voice that told me not yet might someday be hers. I keep one thing visible on my desk, a single sheet from that lost journal. I don't know how it found me, but it's real. I checked the fibers, the ink, and the indentation of my own writing. To remember is to be responsible. I read it every morning, and though I no longer dream, I live like someone who's still being evaluated. Whatever the library is, archive, filter, intelligence, it hasn't left. I just learned how to wait. And maybe that's what this has always been. Not a story about hidden knowledge, but about how we act when knowledge is withheld. What we become when the truth stops answering back. It started when I woke up, knowing things I'd never learned. Details about strangers' dreams as if they'd been my own. Most nights my sleep was forgettable, just static and vague impressions that slipped away with the morning light. But 2 weeks ago, something changed. I remember the first dream vividly, which was already unusual. I was standing in a wide stone courtyard surrounded by people I didn't know, but somehow recognized. They all turned to face the same direction at once, and a voice, not loud but impossibly clear, spoke a word I didn't understand. I woke up in a cold sweat, the sound still echoing in my ears. I dismissed it at first, maybe stress or two.
Much news before bed. But then it happened again. And again, every night since, always different places, different people, but the same feeling of purpose, of being part of something vast and unfinished. It was subtle at first, but I started.
Recognizing people from the dreams in real life, on sidewalks, in passing cars, even a barista at my usual cafe. I wouldn't have believed it myself if they hadn't reacted too. A brief moment of stillness in their expression, a flicker of recognition they quickly buried. None of us said anything. We didn't have to. The silence said enough. I started keeping a notebook. Not just the dreams, but the waking moments too. Small things. Headlines that matched the themes I saw in sleep. Symbols I didn't understand showing up in graffiti or clothing brands. And always that feeling, an undercurrent, like something was pressing through the cracks of our collective mind. My name is Maren Wells. I'm a freelance editor with no history of mental illness, no use of psychoactive drugs, no mystical leanings. I've lived alone for 5 years, never keeping a journal before this. But now I write every day, because I'm not the only one. Message boards, obscure subreddits, encrypted chat groups, there's chatter. People are dreaming the same dreams, and they're changing. It's not just that we remember them now, it's that they're trying to tell us something. Something old, something patient, something waking up. It didn't take long before my curiosity turned into something closer to obsession. I stopped brushing off the dreams and started looking for patterns. The symbols were the first thread. Simple geometric shapes at first, interlocking circles, a downward-pointing triangle inside a square. But they showed up too often to ignore. At first, in dreams, etched in stone or glowing faintly in the sky. Then, in real life, a sticker on a lamppost. A pendant worn by a woman on the subway. A graffiti tag on a closed storefront, partially scrubbed but still visible. I began to search online. Not just Google, but forums where the conversation was more coded. One subreddit stood out, not in popularity, but in tone. The users weren't theorizing, they were reporting. Lucid Dream Signal was the name. Each post was structured the same way: date, dream sequence, encounter, symbol noted, post-wake impressions. Some entries were vague or poetic, but others were clinical, detailed, even time-stamped. And what struck me most was the consistency. Different users, different cities, even different countries. Yet they described the same voice, the same sense of being led somewhere. Like dream navigation wasn't random anymore, like it was coordinated. I reached out to a few of them cautiously, not as Marin Wells, but under a throwaway handle. Most ignored me, but one didn't. Their username was REMPath. Their messages were clipped, but not unfriendly. They asked how long I'd been having the dreams, whether I'd experienced shifts in perception while awake, and if the voice ever said the same phrase more than once. I told them yes, though I hadn't written it down until now. Return through the mirror. It made no sense to me. But REMPath's reply came instantly. Same here, exactly that, it's happening faster now. They sent me a link to a private archive, a decentralized drive filled with audio clips, dream journals, even EEG scans. Some of it looked amateur, but some wasn't. There were neurologist reports, names blacked out, sleep lab data from what appeared to be government trials. One file chilled me. A scanned memo dated 1996 referencing an abandoned research directive labeled Oniric Integration Phase 3, Autonomous Signal Interpretation. It ended with a note in red ink. Discontinued activation window. Missed. Await spontaneous re-emergence. I stared at that line for a long time. Spontaneous re-emergence. This wasn't new. Whatever this was, it had happened before. By the end of the week, I was dreaming in sequences, scenes that picked up where the last had left off. They didn't feel like dreams anymore. They felt rehearsed. In one, I stood on a beach made of glass shards, watching waves crash in reverse. In another, I moved through a stone corridor lit by flickering blue glyphs that pulsed with a rhythm I later realized matched my resting heart rate. But it wasn't until I traced one of the corridor symbols online that I started to understand what I was seeing. A linguistics forum archived an obscure thesis from the late 80s, pre-axial cognitive codes in shared dream states. The paper referenced a covert study conducted through something called the Lambeth Protocol. The author, Dr. A. Kendricks, claimed that ancient cultures didn't interpret dreams, they navigated them like language, and some symbols, he argued, predated writing, not just on cave walls, but across civilizations separated by oceans, circles within triangles, nested grids, all of it aligned with what I was seeing. More unsettling was Kendricks's final conclusion. There is evidence that certain dream patterns are not individual experiences, but components of a distributed network designed to transmit something across generations. I found a digitized interview with Kendricks clearly recorded without his knowledge. He looked worn out, distracted, chain-smoking while answering quietly from what appeared to be a motel room. At one point, the interviewer asked, "So what is it then? A signal? A code?" Kendricks exhaled slowly and said, "Not a code, a memory, one that doesn't belong to any one person. It's humanity remembering itself." The next day, I searched for Kendricks. No published work past 1991, no obituary, nothing. Like he'd evaporated. I mentioned this to REMPath, who sent me a single reply. They didn't silence him. He went quiet on purpose, said it wasn't safe to translate it all, said the dreaming mind was only one layer. The signal sits beneath perception, and when it aligns across enough minds, it triggers something. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I closed my laptop and just sat there, trying to process it. This wasn't about dreams anymore. It was about what happens when too many of us start remembering the same thing. It started with a map. A topographical scan buried in the Lambeth Protocol files, labeled only Shared Convergence Zone Preliminary Correlation. At first, it looked like noise, blurred terrain, overlays of heat signatures and geospatial anomalies, but the coordinates were real. Northern California, outside a town I knew from a hiking trip years ago. Nothing there but decommissioned logging roads and forgotten fire towers. I hadn't planned to go. I told myself I was just collecting information, staying curious. But by Friday, I had packed a bag. I drove up early, alone, following the GPS until the signal dropped and the road narrowed into gravel. The deeper I went, the more the silence shifted. Not the absence of sound, but something in the stillness, an expectation, like the trees were listening. I parked near an old ranger station, long since gutted by time. Windows smashed, roof partially collapsed. The inside smelled of mildew and ash. But the walls were covered in chalk drawings, fresh ones. Circles, triangles, and a grid, just like the ones from my dreams, mapped across one entire room. Someone had been here. Someone else was following the same trail. I took photos, then turned to leave when I noticed a hatch behind the station, half buried in pine needles. It was rusted shut, but I pried it open with a fallen branch. A narrow stairwell descended into a space that shouldn't have existed, a concrete room, dry and cold, with no markings except for one phrase etched in faint paint along the far wall. "You are already inside." My flashlight flickered. I stayed calm, breathing evenly, reminding myself this was still a place, not a dream. But then I saw the floor. Dozens of shoes lined up neatly along the wall. No dust on them.
As if someone had left them there minutes ago. I backed away slowly, heart pounding, every instinct screaming that I'd crossed a line. As I climbed back into daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that the space hadn't just been built, it had been remembered. That night I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I just kept replaying the words on the wall.
Because they weren't just a message, they were a diagnosis. And if the dreaming mind was part of a larger network, then waking life was no longer entirely mine. I tried to go back to normal, or at least the version of normal I remembered from a few weeks ago, but the threshold had been crossed. Every conversation felt like an interruption. Every moment awake carried the quiet echo of something deeper, pulling just beneath the surface. The dreams became lucid without effort. I no longer had to remind myself I was dreaming. I just knew. And within them, the network grew. Others were there now, not as fragments or symbols, but as people I could recognize from waking life. Rempath appeared once, standing beside a massive reflecting pool beneath a black sky. "They're tracking dream signatures now," they said, voice
Low, almost regretful.
"Sleep labs, consumer EEGs, even meditation apps. It's not just data anymore. It was a detection." I asked what they meant, but they were already walking away, dissolving into the surface of the water like smoke. The next morning, my inbox was empty. Rempath was gone. No trace of their account, no archives of our messages. I checked the decentralized drive, scrubbed clean.
No logs, no footprints, as if none of it had ever existed. That was when I noticed the van parked across from my building, dark windows, no plates. It stayed there all day. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I visited a friend I hadn't
Seen in months. Anna, a cognitive researcher who once ran EEG studies at a university sleep lab before shifting into tech. I told her just enough to sound theoretical. She didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. "You're not crazy," she said, handing me a folder she'd kept hidden even from her colleagues. Inside were copies of sleep pattern analyses that showed perfect synchronicity across test subjects during spontaneous lucid events, some separated by continents. "We flagged it as a data error at first," she said, "but it kept happening. Same timestamps, same waveform clusters, and always the same transition phrase just before REM onset, spoken aloud by half the subjects without prompting. Return. Through the mirror." My skin went cold. "They shut the study down," she added. "Said it violated consent parameters, but it wasn't about ethics. It was about control. We were documenting the system we weren't supposed to see." I asked her what it meant. She didn't answer, just looked at me and said, "If you publish anything, they'll come for you. Not to discredit you, to interrupt you. Whatever this is, it doesn't want to be explained. It wants to be remembered." That night, I dreamt of the mirror again. This time, it was already broken. The morning after I saw the broken mirror in my dream, I woke up with blood on my pillow. A small trickle from my left ear. No pain, no injury, I could see. I sat upright, pulse steady but slow, like my body had adjusted to something without informing me. I stayed home. No hospital, no calls. Instead, I opened my laptop and typed out everything I'd found, every pattern, every message, every symbol, cross-referenced with known neurological data. I kept it clinical, focused, but something in me knew it wouldn't matter. When I hit save, the screen froze, not crashed, just stopped. Then it went black. The machine didn't reboot. It never turned back on. That afternoon, Anna texted once. They accessed my cloud.
"I'm burning everything. Get out now!" Then silence. Her number stopped working. Her social accounts vanished. Her website returned a 404. I went to her apartment. Empty. Not cleared out. Scrubbed. Furniture gone. Mail slot. Sealed. Like she'd
never lived there. That night I slept without meaning to. In the dream, I wasn't alone. Hundreds of us stood in silence in a place without a sky. Above us, not stars, but points of light arranged in neural patterns. A voice, no longer distant, spoke directly to each of us. Not with words, but with a kind of emotional syntax, a memory deeper than language. We weren't being recruited, we were being recalled. Intelligence, whatever it was, wasn't alien, it wasn't external, it was ancestral, dormant, coded into our physiology, reactivating now through synchronized states of consciousness. The dreaming wasn't the message. Dreaming was the method. The voice showed me a vision. Cities overlaid with fractal symbols. Populations unknowingly participating in the signal. Every search query, every targeted ad, every biometric scan nudging us toward convergence. Not control, coherence. A species reassembling itself. When I woke, the van was gone. In its place was a mark on my front door, 3 interlocking circles, drawn in charcoal. I opened the door and found a package. No return address. Inside was a headset.
Not consumer grade, medical, EEG grade, and a note. They failed in '96. Don't let them fail again. I knew then there would be no more hiding. Whatever this was, I had already joined it. Not as a believer, as a carrier. I don't dream the same way anymore.
Not because the dreams have stopped, but because I no longer experience them as separate from waking life. The boundaries are gone. Days bleed into nights, memory into intuition. I kept the headset hidden for a week before finally using it. It didn't require a power source or an app. Just contact me. The moment the sensors touched my scalp, I saw the network, not as metaphor, but as structure. Not digital, not spiritual, something older. A scaffolding of thought lay dormant for generations, passed silently through blood and breath, and now reignited. Intelligence was never outside us. It wasn't a visitor or invader. It was human potential, archived and preserved like a backup, file in the folds of our biology, waiting. The signal wasn't a message in the way we understand communication. It was a pattern designed to resonate with a critical mass of minds tuned to the right frequency, lucid, aware, and willing to remember. That was the function of the dreams, to align, to calibrate. And once enough of us reached that state, something clicked, like a synapse jumping across a collective brain. The intelligence didn't arrive. It woke me up. And it had been ours all along. I don't know how many of us there are now. The forums are mostly gone, scrubbed or abandoned. But sometimes, in public spaces, I feel it. A glance from someone, who knows, the subtle stillness when a group of strangers momentarily shares the same pause. You'd miss it if you weren't looking. Most people do, that's how it's meant to be. This was never about exposure. It was about evolution. A quiet one. Not in our bodies, but in the architecture of thought. We're not being led. We're becoming. I still write, though not for anyone else. Just pages in a locked notebook, filled with sketches and phrases I don't always understand until days later. It's how I stay grounded. Or maybe it's how I stay open. Last night I walked past a cafe window and caught my reflection in the glass. For a second it didn't look like me. Not exactly. It looked like someone older, deeper, watching through my eyes, and I felt no fear, only recognition. We're not here to escape the system. We're here to finish remembering it, quietly, together, from the inside out.